The year is 496 BC, and it has been 12 years since Lars Porsena lifted his siege of Rome and acknowledged the Republic's right to exist. 12 years since Horatius held the bridge, since Scaevola burned his hand, since Cliovola swam the Tiber. 12 years of the Roman Republic learning how to survive, how to govern itself, how to deal with the constant challenges that freedom brings. Those 12 years had not been peaceful. Exactly. Peace was never really on the table for Rome. Not in this era when every city was constantly jockeying for position, when alliances shifted like sand, when today's friend could become tomorrow's enemy over a border dispute or a trade disagreement, or just because someone felt insulted at a diplomatic dinner. But they had been relatively stable years, which in the ancient world was about as good as you could hope for. The Republic's institutions had solidified. The consulship had become an established office with clear procedures and precedents. The Senate had grown into its role as the primary deliberative body. The assemblies met regularly and made decisions about war and peace, about laws and policies, about all the mundane details of civic life. Romans had gotten used to being citizens rather than subjects. Children who had been born after the expulsion of the Tarquins were now old enough to understand civic duty, to participate in assemblies, to serve in the army. The Republic was no longer a radical experiment, it was simply how Rome worked, the normal state of affairs, the only system most young Romans had ever known. The Tarquin family, meanwhile, had faded from immediate relevance. Oh, they were still out there somewhere, still nursing their grievances, still convinced that Rome had wronged them and that their restoration was inevitable. But without major external support, they were just exiles muttering about past glories, increasingly irrelevant as time passed and Rome prospered without them. Tarquinius Superbus himself, the last king, the tyrant whose crimes had sparked the revolution, had died sometime around 505 BC, depending on which ancient sources you trust. The circumstances of his death varied in different accounts. Some said he died in exile in Cumae, broken and bitter, having failed to reclaim his throne. Others claimed he died of disease. Still others hinted at assassination, suggesting that even his hosts had grown tired of his plotting. Regardless of how he died, the important thing was that he was dead. The man who had personified royal tyranny, whose name had become synonymous with everything Romans hated about monarchy, was gone. That should have been the end of the Tarquin threat, except it wasn't. Because Tarquin had sons. Not the sons you've already heard about. Titus and Aruns and Sextus had all died years ago, casualties of the revolution and the Battle of Silva Arsia and various other violent ends. But Tarquin had apparently been a busy man before his fall, because there were other Tarquin relatives floating around, cousins and nephews and various hangers-on who bore the family name and believed they had a claim to Rome. These remaining Tarquins, whose exact identities and relationships the ancient sources are frustratingly vague about, because apparently Tarquin was considered sufficient identification, had spent the years since 508 BC trying to find someone, anyone, who would help them reclaim what they saw as their rightful position. They had approached various cities and kings, had offered alliances and promises, and whatever inducements they could manage. Most had refused. Porsena's experience had taught potential allies an important lesson. Rome might be a republic now, but it was a republic full of people willing to burn their own hands off, or swim rivers, or hold bridges alone rather than surrender their freedom. Helping the Tarquins return was more trouble than it was worth. But the Tarquins were persistent, and eventually they found someone willing to listen. Or rather, they found a whole coalition of someones, the Latin League. The Latin League was a confederation of Latin cities in the region of Latium, the area surrounding Rome. These were cities that shared cultural and linguistic ties with Rome. They were all Latin-speaking, all worshipped similar gods, all had similar customs and traditions. In many ways they were Rome's closest relatives, more like cousins or siblings than foreign peoples, which, of course, meant they had all the complex dynamics that families have. Rivalry, competition, resentment, jealousy, and the constant tension between cooperation and conflict. Before Rome's revolution, the relationship between Rome and the Latin cities had been complicated. Under the kings, particularly under the Tarquins, Rome had been the dominant power in Latium. The Latin cities had grudgingly accepted Roman leadership, participating in joint military actions and trading partnerships, but always with an undercurrent of resentment about Rome's superior position. The revolution had changed that dynamic. Suddenly Rome was vulnerable, distracted by internal reorganization, focused on establishing its new government rather than on projecting power externally. Some Latin cities had seen this as an opportunity. If Rome was weak, if the Republic was unstable, maybe this was the time to challenge Roman dominance, to reset the power balance in Latium. The Tarquins, approaching the Latin League with their proposal, found a receptive audience. They didn't need to convince the Latins that monarchy was better than republic. The Latins didn't particularly care about Rome's internal government. What the Tarquins could offer was a justification for war, a pretext for challenging Rome that looked more noble than simple territorial aggression. Help us restore the rightful order. The Tarquins argued. Rome has violated sacred tradition by expelling its king. The gods favor monarchy. By supporting our restoration, you're not just helping our family, you're upholding divine law and proper governance. It was nonsense, of course. The gods didn't care whether Rome had a king or consuls, but it was convenient nonsense. The kind of justification that allowed the Latin cities to pursue their own interests while claiming higher motives. The Latin League's actual reasons for considering war with Rome were more practical. Rome's republic had proven surprisingly effective. Rather than collapsing into chaos as many had predicted, the city had grown stronger, more unified, more capable. If the trend continued, Rome would soon reassert its dominance over Latium, and the window of opportunity for challenging that dominance would close. Better to act now, while Rome was still relatively vulnerable, while the Republic was still establishing itself. Better to fight Rome before it became too strong to fight. Not all the Latin cities agreed with this logic. Some argued that Rome had been a valuable ally, that cooperation was more beneficial than conflict, that starting a war over the Tarquins' grievances was foolish. But enough cities supported the idea that the League voted to mobilize, to gather an army, to march on Rome and restore the Tarquins by force if necessary. It's worth noting what this meant for Rome. This wasn't an external threat from some distant kingdom or empire. This was Rome's neighbours, cities that Romans had traded with and fought alongside, people who spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods. This was, in effect, a civil war among the Latin peoples. A family conflict escalated to military confrontation, which made it particularly bitter, particularly personal, particularly dangerous. News of the Latin League's decision reached Rome in early spring of 4096 BC. Merchants and travellers brought reports of armies gathering, of cities mobilizing their forces, of the Tarquins moving among the Latin camps, and encouraging the soldiers with promises of Roman wealth and territory once the city fell. The Senate convened immediately to discuss the crisis. The consuls for that year, the sources differ on exactly who they were, with different Roman historians giving different names, which tells you something about how much we can actually trust the details of these early Republican events, called the senators together to debate Rome's response. The mood in the Curia was grim but determined. This wasn't panic like during Porsena's siege. Rome had survived that, had proven it could defend itself, had built confidence in its ability to face existential threats. But this was still serious. The Latin League could field an army as large as or larger than Porsena's had been. A loss could mean the end of the Republic, the restoration of monarchy, everything the revolution had fought for undone. We cannot allow the Tarquins to return, one consul stated plainly. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we must prevent that. The Republic's survival depends on it. Agreed, said one of the senior senators. But how do we fight the entire Latin League? They outnumber us. They have more resources. If this comes to open battle, we're at a disadvantage. Then we need to make sure it doesn't come to open battle. Another senator suggested. We should seek diplomatic solutions. Try to split the League. Convince some cities to remain neutral. Diplomatic solutions have failed, the consul replied. We tried negotiating. They've made their choice. Now we have to make ours. The debate continued for hours, with various senators proposing different strategies. Some advocated defensive warfare, letting the Latins come to Rome and fighting from behind the city's walls. Others argued for offensive action, marching out to meet the enemy before they could threaten the city directly. Still others suggested trying to negotiate with individual Latin cities, offering deals to break the coalition. Eventually, a consensus emerged. Rome would mobilize its full citizen militia and march to meet the Latin League's army, not at Rome's walls, not in a siege scenario, but in open battle at a location of Rome's choosing. This would demonstrate confidence, would show the Latins that Rome wasn't afraid, would force the issue quickly rather than letting the threat linger. It was a risky strategy. If Rome lost the battle, they would have no second defensive line, no fallback position, no walls to hide behind. Everything would depend on the outcome of a single military engagement. But it was also consistent with Roman values as they had developed in the Republic. Romans fought in the open, faced their enemies directly, staked everything on courage and discipline and determination, hiding behind walls, waiting passively for the enemy to make the first move. That was defensive thinking, the mindset of people who didn't believe in their own strength. The Republic had been born from an act of audacious courage. Brutus standing in the forum with a bloody knife, swearing to expel the kings. It would defend itself with the same audacity. The mobilization began immediately. Every male Roman citizen between the ages of 17 and 46 was required to report for military service. This was the citizen militia system in action. Not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, and merchants who became soldiers when Rome needed them, who put down their plows and tools and picked up swords and shields because their city called. The response was remarkable. Thousands of men reported to the Campus Martius, the field of Mars where Rome's armies traditionally gathered and trained. They came with whatever equipment they could afford or scrounge, some with proper bronze armor and good weapons, others with leather protection and improvised spears, all determined to defend the Republic regardless of how well equipped they were. The army that assembled on the Campus Martius in the spring of 4096 BC was Rome's largest force since the Battle of Silva Asia, 12 years earlier, perhaps 12,000 men, organized into centuries and maniples, arranged in the traditional Roman formation that emphasized discipline and mutual support over individual heroics. They weren't professional soldiers. Many had never fought in a serious battle before, but they had something that professionalism couldn't provide. They were fighting for their own freedom, for a republic they had helped build, for the right to govern themselves rather than submit to kings. That motivation, that personal stake in the outcome, made them formidable despite their lack of formal military training. The consuls reviewed the assembled army, made speeches about duty and courage and the defense of freedom, reminded the soldiers what they were fighting for and against. Then they gave the order to march. The Roman army moved northeast from the city, following the ancient roads toward the location where scouts had reported the Latin League's forces were gathering. The destination was a place called Lake Regillus, about 20 miles from Rome, a body of water near the small town of Tusculum in the Alban Hills. It was good ground for a battle, relatively flat terrain near the lake, space for armies to maneuver, clear sightlines. Both sides recognized that this would be the battlefield, that the decisive engagement would happen here, that the fate of Rome and the Tarquins would be determined by whoever held this ground when the fighting ended. As the Roman army marched, the soldiers talked among themselves about what was coming. Veterans of Silva Asia shared stories about fighting Porsenna's forces, offered advice about maintaining formation and supporting your fellow soldiers, tried to prepare the younger men for the chaos and terror of battle. Some soldiers prayed to Mars, the god of war, asking for courage and victory. Others prayed to Jupiter, the king of gods, asking for divine favor and protection. A few prayed to household gods, small personal deities that connected them to home and family, asking to survive so they could return to the people they loved. And some, perhaps, whispered prayers to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, the sons of Jupiter who were known as protectors of cavalry and warriors. These prayers would turn out to be more significant than anyone realized at the time. The Roman army reached Lake Regillus in the late afternoon, set up camp, and prepared for battle. Across the lake they could see the Latin League's army doing the same, a sea of tents and cooking fires, a force that seemed to fill the entire horizon, an enemy that outnumbered them and potentially outmatched them. The Tarquins were over there somewhere, moving among the Latin troops, no doubt telling stories about Rome's weakness, promising rewards when the city fell, stoking enthusiasm for the coming fight. The Roman soldiers, looking across the lake at their enemies, understood that tomorrow would determine everything. Win, and the Republic would be secured against the Tarquin threat forever. Lose, and everything they had fought for would be undone. The revolution reversed, monarchy restored. No pressure. As night fell over Lake Regillus, two armies settled in to rest before battle. Soldiers checked their equipment, sharpened weapons, wrote mental letters to family members they might never see again. Officers walked among the troops, offering encouragement, maintaining discipline, ensuring everyone understood the plan for tomorrow's fight. And in Rome, 20 miles away, citizens who had stayed behind waited anxiously for news, praying to whatever gods would listen, hoping that their soldiers, their brothers and fathers and sons, would return victorious. The stage was set. The players were in position. All that remained was for the curtain to rise and the performance to begin. Tomorrow would be the Battle of Lake Regillus. Tomorrow, Rome would either secure its freedom or lose everything. Tomorrow, the gods themselves would allegedly intervene in human affairs in one of the most famous divine manifestations in Roman history. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, soldiers on both sides tried to sleep, tried not to think too much about what was coming, tried to find whatever peace they could before the morning brought violence and blood, and the terrible lottery of battle, where courage and skill mattered, but luck mattered more. The Republic's fate would be decided by whoever stood when the fighting stopped, and Rome's soldiers, despite their fears and uncertainties, were determined to be the ones left standing. The Latin League's army camped across Lake Regillus was not a unified force in the way we might imagine modern armies to be unified. It wasn't a single cohesive military under one clear chain of command. It was, instead, a coalition, a collection of contingents from various Latin cities, each led by its own commanders, each maintaining its own identity and interests, all theoretically working toward the same goal but with varying levels of enthusiasm and commitment. This was typical of ancient warfare, especially among city-states and loose confederations. You couldn't just merge several cities' armies into one homogeneous force and expect it to operate like a well-oiled machine. Each city had its own military traditions, its own command structures, its own way of fighting. Getting them to cooperate effectively required constant negotiation, careful management of competing egos, and a shared objective compelling enough to overcome local rivalries. The Latin League had that shared objective, at least nominally: restore the Tarquins and humble Rome. But beneath that surface unity were all sorts of divisions and complications that would become relevant as the battle approached. Some Latin cities were genuinely committed to the cause. They saw Rome's republic as a threat to traditional order, believed the Tarquins had legitimate grievances, or simply wanted to see Rome brought down a few notches. These cities had sent substantial forces, well-equipped and motivated, ready to fight seriously. Other cities were there more out of obligation than conviction. The Latin League operated on a principle of mutual defense and collective decision-making. When the League voted to mobilize, member cities were expected to contribute forces. Refusing could mean political isolation, loss of trade privileges, or worse. So some cities sent troops because they had to, not because they particularly wanted to fight Rome. And then there were the opportunists. Cities that saw this as a chance to gain advantage, to position themselves favorably in whatever order emerged after the battle, to curry favor with potential winners, or hedge their bets against potential losses. These contingents were there for political calculations rather than passionate commitment. This diversity of motivation would matter when the fighting started, when soldiers had to decide how much they were willing to risk, how hard they were willing to fight, whether this cause was worth dying for. The largest contingent came from the city of Tusculum, which had taken a leading role in organizing the coalition. Tusculum was one of the most prominent Latin cities, wealthy and powerful, with a long history of both cooperation and competition with Rome. The Tusculans had their own reasons for wanting to challenge Roman dominance: territorial disputes, trade rivalries, the usual frictions between neighboring powers. The Tusculan commander was a man whose name the ancient sources give as Octavius Mamilius, and he was apparently married to one of the Tarquin daughters, which gave him a personal stake in the restoration project. This family connection made him a natural leader for the pro-Tarquin coalition, someone who could claim to be fighting for family honor as well as political objectives. Mamilius was, by all accounts, a capable military commander. He understood tactics and strategy, knew how to manage the complicated politics of coalition warfare, and had enough personal courage and charisma to inspire the troops under his direct command. If anyone could make this disparate collection of Latin soldiers into an effective fighting force, it was him. But even Mamilius couldn't entirely overcome the structural problems of coalition warfare. The different Latin contingents maintained their own camps, cooked their own meals, held their own briefings. They cooperated when necessary, but remained fundamentally separate, each contingent loyal first to its own city and only secondarily to the collective cause. This wasn't necessarily a fatal weakness. Many ancient battles were fought by coalition forces that managed to work together effectively despite their diversity. But it did mean that the Latin League's army was potentially vulnerable to anything that undermined coalition unity. Battlefield setbacks that made some cities question the entire enterprise, political complications that shifted alliance calculations, or simple communication failures in the heat of combat. The Tarquins themselves moved among the Latin camps, visiting different contingents, offering encouragement, promising rewards for the soldiers who would help restore them to power. They were, in effect, campaigning, pining, trying to maintain enthusiasm for a cause that benefited them far more than it benefited the average Latin soldier. When we retake Rome, they would tell assembled troops, the city's wealth will be shared with those who helped us. Land, gold, slaves. Rome has accumulated much in recent years, and it will be yours as spoils of war. It was the kind of promise commanders have made throughout history to motivate soldiers. Fight and win, and you'll be rewarded. Sometimes these promises were kept. Often they weren't. But they were effective in the moment, giving soldiers something concrete to fight for beyond abstract political objectives. The younger Tarquin, whichever one was actually leading the family's efforts at this point, the sources are maddeningly vague, also made more ideological arguments. Rome's republic, he claimed, was an abomination, a violation of natural order. Kings ruled by divine right. The gods favoured monarchy. By helping restore the Tarquins, the Latin soldiers were doing sacred work, upholding tradition, ensuring the gods' favour. Whether the soldiers actually believed this is another question. Ancient people were generally more religious than modern people, took divine favour seriously, worried about angering the gods, but they were also practical enough to recognise self-serving rhetoric when they heard it. The Tarquins were arguing for monarchy because it benefited the Tarquins. That didn't necessarily make them wrong, but it did make their arguments suspect. Still, the promises and arguments served their purpose. The Latin army was ready to fight, or at least willing to fight, which in ancient warfare was about as good as you could hope for. The army's size was substantial. Estimates vary, but probably somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men, larger than the Roman force across the lake, though not overwhelmingly so. The numerical advantage would matter, but it wouldn't be decisive by itself. The actual fighting would determine the outcome more than the raw numbers. The Latin forces were reasonably well equipped by the standards of early 5th century BC Italy. Most soldiers had shields and spears, the basic equipment of ancient infantry. Some had swords for close combat. The wealthier soldiers had bronze armor, breastplates and helmets that offered real protection against weapons. The poorer soldiers made do with leather armor or just thick cloth, which was better than nothing, but not by much. Cavalry was present, but not numerous. Ancient Italian warfare in this period was primarily infantry-focused. Horses were expensive to maintain, required specialized training, and weren't particularly effective in the wooded, hilly terrain that characterized much of the region. Most battles were decided by foot soldiers grinding against each other in formation, not by dramatic cavalry charges. The Latin commanders held a war council on the evening before the battle, gathering the leaders of different contingents to coordinate strategy. These councils were always politically delicate. Every commander wanted his city's forces to be assigned an honourable position in the line, wanted recognition for his own capabilities, wanted to avoid being blamed if things went wrong. Mamilius, as the overall commander, had to manage all these competing egos while also making sound tactical decisions. He proposed a straightforward plan. The Latin army would form up in traditional phalanx formation, with the best troops in the centre and the flanks held by more numerous but less reliable forces. They would advance on the Roman position and force a direct confrontation, using their numerical superiority to simply overwhelm the Roman line. It wasn't an elegant plan, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes simple was better. The Latins had more soldiers than Rome. If they could bring all those soldiers to bear in a sustained push, if they could prevent the Romans from using terrain or tactics to negate the numerical advantage, they would probably win. Superior numbers in ancient warfare usually did win, assuming the soldiers were willing to actually fight. Some commanders questioned whether forcing a direct confrontation was wise. Wouldn't it be better to maneuver, to try to catch the Romans at a disadvantage, to avoid the kind of straightforward slugfest that gave Rome's famously disciplined soldiers their best chance? The Romans want us to be clever, Mamilius reportedly said. They want us to overthink this, to try complicated maneuvers that could go wrong. We have the advantage in numbers, let's use it. We march forward, we engage their line, we push until they break. It's worked before, it will work now. The council agreed, though not unanimously. The plan was set. Tomorrow morning, the Latin League would offer battle to Rome's Republic, and one way or another, the Tarquin question would be resolved. As night fell over the Latin camp, the mood was confident but not complacent. The soldiers understood they were facing Romans, who had a reputation for discipline and determination, even if they were now disorganized by political revolution. This wouldn't be an easy fight, but it was a fight the Latins expected to win. Across the lake, the Roman camp presented a very different atmosphere. Where the Latin camp was large and diverse, reflecting the coalition nature of the army, the Roman camp was smaller and more unified. These were all citizens of one city, all fighting for the same cause, all understanding exactly what was at stake. The Roman commanders, the consuls whose names have been lost or confused in the historical record, walked among the troops that evening, speaking to soldiers, offering reassurance, gauging morale. What they found was a mixture of anxiety and determination. The soldiers were scared, certainly. They weren't professional warriors who had become inured to the fear of battle. They were ordinary citizens who had put on armor because Rome needed them, who would return to farming or crafts or trade after this was over, assuming they survived. But they were also committed. Every Roman soldier knew what defeat would mean. The return of the Tarquins, the end of the Republic, the loss of everything they had gained in the revolution. That knowledge created resolve that fear couldn't entirely overcome. They were scared, but they would fight anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable. "Remember Silver Arcia," one consul told the troops. "Our fathers and older brothers fought Tarquin's army 12 years ago and won. They were citizens then, just as you are now. They weren't professional soldiers, they were Romans defending their freedom, and they won because free men fighting for their own liberty are stronger than any army fighting for a tyrant's ambition." It was good rhetoric, invoking the legendary victory that had saved the Republic in its first year. Whether it was entirely accurate, whether the soldiers at Silver Arcia had really won because of their commitment to freedom, or just because Horatius and others had made tactically sound decisions at crucial moments, was less important than the effect it had on morale. The soldiers believed the story, they drew courage from it, and in ancient warfare, courage and morale often mattered as much as weapons and numbers. The Roman plan for the battle was simpler than the Latin plan, mostly because Rome had fewer options. They would form up in standard formation, hold their ground and trust that Roman discipline and determination would carry the day. No clever tactics, no surprise maneuvers, just straightforward combat between two roughly evenly matched forces. The Roman formation would emphasize depth over width. Rather than spreading their line thin to match the Latin front, they would form deeper ranks, creating a formation that could absorb pressure and maintain structure even when pushed hard. The theory was that a deep, dense formation of determined soldiers would be harder to break than a thinner, wider line, even if the thin line initially surrounded the deeper formation on the flanks. It was sound reasoning based on the principles of warfare as Rome understood them. Whether it would actually work remained to be seen. As the Roman soldiers settled in for the night, some wrote letters to family members, scratching messages on wooden tablets or pieces of cloth, leaving them with camp servants who would deliver them if the soldiers didn't return. Others sharpened weapons, checked armor straps, performed the small rituals and preparations that gave them a sense of control in an uncontrollable situation. And many prayed. Roman religion was transactional. You made offerings to gods and expected benefits in return. Before battle, soldiers made promises. "If you let me survive this fight, I'll sacrifice a pig to you. If we win tomorrow, I'll dedicate a portion of any spoils to your temple. If my brother makes it home safely, I'll honor you every year on this date." The gods, in Roman belief, responded to these promises. They intervened in human affairs when properly propitiated, when given sufficient reason to care about particular outcomes. It was a mercenary relationship perhaps, but it was how Romans understood the divine, not as distant moral authorities, but as powerful beings who could be negotiated with, who had their own interests and could be persuaded to align those interests with yours. Some soldiers prayed specifically to Mars, the god of war, Rome's special protector, and the father of Romulus. Mars was the god who understood soldiers, who appreciated courage and discipline, who supposedly took particular interest in Rome's military fortunes. If any god would help Rome in battle, it would be Mars. Others prayed to Jupiter, the king of gods, asking for general favor and protection. Jupiter was powerful but distant, not as personally invested in individual battles as Mars might be. But he was also the ultimate authority among the gods, and having Jupiter's favor meant having the backing of divine order itself. And some soldiers, remembering old stories and family traditions, prayed to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins. These gods were associated with cavalry and warriors, were believed to help those who called upon them in desperate circumstances. They were less prominent than Mars or Jupiter in Roman religion, but they had their devotees, their believers who thought the twins might intervene if asked properly. These prayers to Castor and Pollux would turn out to be more significant than anyone expected. But that revelation was still hours away, waiting for the chaos and desperation of actual combat to make divine intervention necessary. As midnight passed and the early hours of the morning crept by, both camps gradually fell silent. Soldiers slept, or tried to sleep, or lay awake staring at tent ceilings and thinking about the morning. Officers made final rounds, checking that sentries were alert, that weapons were stored properly, that everything was as ready as it could be. The lake itself was quiet, its waters dark and still under a moonless sky. In the morning, those waters would reflect the carnage of battle, would receive the blood of soldiers from both sides, would witness one of the more significant military engagements in early Roman history. But for now, in these last hours of peace before the violence began, Lake Regillus was just a body of water, neutral and indifferent to the human dramas unfolding around it. The lake didn't care who won or lost tomorrow. It would still be here when the battle was over, when the armies had moved on, when the dead had been buried and the survivors had gone home. That perspective, the long view, the geological timescale that makes human conflict seem brief and ultimately insignificant, is worth keeping in mind. From the lake's perspective, or from the perspective of the distant future looking back, the Battle of Lake Regillus was just one moment, one day, one convergence of forces that mattered intensely to the people involved but was just another entry in the long catalogue of human violence. But to the soldiers sleeping fitfully in their camps, to the Romans who had staked their freedom on this battle, to the Latins who had committed their city's honour and resources to this fight, the perspective that mattered was the immediate one. Tomorrow morning they would wake up and put on their armour and walk onto a battlefield where people would try to kill them. The outcome would determine whether Rome remained free or returned to monarchy, whether the Latin League succeeded in humbling its rival or failed and faced Rome's retribution. That was real. That mattered. That was worth losing sleep over and praying about and being terrified of. Dawn was perhaps 4 hours away. The battle would begin shortly after sunrise, when there was enough light to see properly, when commanders could observe the enemy's dispositions and soldiers could identify friend from foe. That was the civilized way to conduct warfare in this era. You didn't fight in darkness or twilight if you could avoid it. Too much could go wrong. Too many opportunities for friendly fire or disorientation or units getting lost. So both armies had those 4 hours to rest, to prepare mentally for what was coming, to make peace with whatever gods they believed in, to say goodbye to life as they knew it, and hello to the terrible lottery of battle where virtue and courage mattered, but weren't enough, where luck and accident could kill the bravest soldier or spare the most cowardly one. In Rome, 20 miles away, citizens who hadn't marched with the army waited for news. They knew the battle was coming, knew roughly where and when it would happen. They could do nothing but wait and pray and hope that their fathers and brothers and sons would return victorious. In Latin cities throughout the region, other families waited with similar anxiety for different outcomes. Mothers prayed for sons' safety. Wives wondered if they would become widows tomorrow. Children too young to understand the politics involved knew only that something important and dangerous was happening, that the adults were worried, that the world felt uncertain and frightening. War, in the end, is a human experience more than a political or military one. Yes, it's about territory and power and resources and honor, but fundamentally, it's about people. People fighting, people dying, people grieving, people trying to make sense of violence and loss and the arbitrary cruelty of fate. The Battle of Lake Regillus would be remembered in Roman history for what happened next, for the divine intervention that supposedly occurred, for the miraculous appearance that turned the tide of combat. But before any of that could happen, before the gods allegedly intervened and history was made, there had to be a battle. There had to be thousands of men willing to stand in formation and fight each other, willing to kill and risk death for causes they might not fully understand but committed to anyway. That willingness, that choice to fight despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite knowing how brutal and arbitrary combat could be, that was what made history possible. Without soldiers willing to march and fight and bleed, political disputes would remain just disputes, negotiations that went nowhere, tensions that never exploded into violence. But humans kept making that choice, kept deciding that some causes were worth fighting for, kept putting on armor and picking up weapons and walking onto battlefields where they might die for reasons that would seem increasingly distant and abstract once the actual killing started. Lake Regillus in 496 BC was just one more example of this eternal pattern. The specifics were unique to Rome and the Latin League and the Tarquins and the young Republic, but the fundamentals, armies facing each other, soldiers scared but determined, commanders making plans that would probably fail as soon as contact with the enemy disrupted them, those were universal. The hours crept toward dawn. The armies slept or didn't sleep. The lake waited, patient and eternal, and tomorrow came, as tomorrow always does, bringing with it whatever consequences human choices and divine interventions and dumb luck would create. The Battle of Lake Regillus was about to begin. Dawn broke over Lake Regillus on a spring morning in 496 BC, the kind of beautiful day that makes you forget humans are capable of organized violence. The sky was clear, the air was crisp but not cold, birds were singing in the trees around the lake, completely oblivious to the fact that thousands of men were about to try very hard to kill each other. There's something deeply ironic about fighting battles on beautiful days. You'd think the weather would have the decency to match the mood. Ominous clouds, dramatic lightning, maybe some appropriately gloomy fog. Instead, you get sunshine and pleasant temperatures, nature's cheerful indifference to human suffering on full display. The Roman soldiers woke before dawn, as soldiers do when they know battle is coming. Some had actually slept, exhausted enough that fear couldn't keep them awake. Others had spent the night in that half-conscious state where you're not quite asleep, but not quite awake either, your mind churning through worst-case scenarios while your body tries unsuccessfully to rest. They rose, ate a quick breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just enough food to give them energy for the fighting ahead, and began the process of arming themselves. This took longer than you might think. Ancient armor wasn't something you could just throw on like modern clothing. Each piece had straps and buckles, had to be adjusted properly, had to be checked and rechecked to make sure nothing would slip or fail at a crucial moment. The wealthier soldiers had bronze breastplates that required help to put on. Couldn't be managed alone. They relied on friends or servants to secure the straps, to make sure the armor sat properly on their shoulders and torso, to check that mobility wasn't too restricted. Armor was always a trade-off between protection and movement. Too much protection and you couldn't fight effectively. Too little and you were vulnerable. Finding the right balance was an art. Poorer soldiers had simpler preparations. Leather armor was easier to manage, required less assistance, but it also offered less protection, which was something they were acutely aware of as they watched their wealthier companions strap on proper bronze. Ancient warfare was unequal in ways that modern warfare with its standardized equipment isn't quite. Your chances of survival depended partly on courage and skill, yes, but also significantly on whether you could afford good armor. The Roman commanders moved through the camp, observing the preparations, offering last words of encouragement. They didn't give big speeches. Those had been done the night before. Now it was just quiet conversations, personal touches, making sure each soldier felt seen and valued and remembered that they weren't alone in this. Stay in formation. One consul reminded a group of younger soldiers, "That's the most important thing. If the line breaks, if everyone starts fighting individually, we lose. But if we hold formation, if we support each other and maintain structure, we're nearly impossible to beat. Roman discipline wins battles. Remember that." The soldiers nodded, trying to look confident, trying not to think too much about what holding formation would actually mean once people started dying around them. Across the lake, the Latin League's army was going through similar preparations, though with more complexity because of the coalition nature of their force. Each contingent prepared according to its own city's customs and traditions, which meant the Latin camp was a patchwork of different practices and rituals rather than a unified procedure. Some contingents sacrificed animals to the gods, reading omens in the entrails, trying to determine if the gods favored their cause. The results, predictably, were interpreted as favorable. Ancient omens had a remarkable tendency to confirm whatever the person reading them wanted to believe, but the rituals served their purpose regardless of divine input. They gave soldiers a sense of control, a feeling that they had taken steps to ensure success, a belief that the gods were on their side. Mamilius, the overall Latin commander, rode between the different contingents, checking readiness, answering questions, projecting the confidence that commanders are supposed to project even when they're not entirely confident themselves. Leadership in ancient warfare required a certain amount of performance, of convincing your troops that you knew exactly what you were doing even when you were making it up as you went along. The Tarquins were also moving through the camp, though their presence was more symbolic than practical. They weren't military commanders. Whatever tactical skill they might have once possessed was rusty from years of exile, but they represented the cause everyone was supposedly fighting for, and their visible presence reminded soldiers what the battle was about. "Today we reclaim what was stolen from us," the younger Tarquin told assembled troops. "Today we restore proper order to Rome. Today we prove that the gods favor tradition and legitimacy over rebellion and chaos. Fight well, and you'll be remembered as heroes who saved Rome from itself." It was good rhetoric, even if the underlying premise was questionable. The soldiers cheered, or at least made the appropriate noises. Whether they genuinely believed they were saving Rome, or were just fighting because their cities had committed to this course of action, was harder to determine. Probably it varied from soldier to soldier, from contingent to contingent. By mid-morning, both armies were ready to move. The Roman force formed up first, marching out of their camp in organized centuries, each unit maintaining its position in the larger formation. The Roman system emphasized structure and predictability. Every soldier knew his place, knew the men around him, knew exactly what was expected. It made the army less flexible than more loosely organized forces, but it also made it more resistant to chaos and panic. The Roman formation was deep rather than wide. As planned, they formed what would later be called a phalanx, though the Romans didn't use that Greek term. It was simply the logical way to arrange heavy infantry. Shields locked together, multiple ranks so that if the front rank fell, the second rank could step up, depth creating momentum and resilience. The consuls took their positions near the front, which was traditional for Roman commanders in this era. They didn't command from the rear, watching from a safe distance. They fought with their men, led by example, shared the danger. It was inspiring for the troops, but risky for the Republic. If both consuls died in battle, Rome would be left temporarily leaderless at a critical moment. The Latin League's army took longer to form up, simply because coordinating multiple contingents was more complicated than organizing a unified force. But eventually they managed it, creating a line that was wider than the Roman formation but less deep, using their numerical advantage to create length rather than depth. This was the fundamental difference in their tactical approaches. Rome was betting on depth and discipline, on the ability to maintain formation under pressure, on the hope that a deep, dense mass of determined soldiers could break through whatever they faced. The Latins were betting on width and numbers, on the ability to surround and pressure the Roman flanks, on the hope that superior numbers would eventually overwhelm Roman structure. Both approaches had merit. Both had worked in previous battles. Which one would work today would depend on execution, on how well each army maintained its formation under stress, on leadership decisions made in the moment, and on the countless small factors that determined ancient battles: who got tired first, which unit broke first, where the psychological pressure became too much to bear. The armies advanced toward each other slowly, deliberately. There were no dramatic charges, no screaming runs across the battlefield. Ancient combat was generally more measured than that, at least initially. You advanced at walking pace, maintaining formation, conserving energy, trying to reach the enemy's line in good order, rather than exhausted from running. As the distance closed, soldiers on both sides could see their opponents clearly. This wasn't fighting anonymous strangers. These were neighbors, people who spoke the same language, who worshipped the same gods, who might even have relatives in the opposing army. Latin cities had intermarried for generations. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to recognize faces in the enemy ranks, to see cousins or former friends or trading partners now standing opposite them with weapons drawn. That recognition made the coming violence more personal, but not necessarily more difficult. Humans are remarkably good at compartmentalizing, at seeing people they know in contexts where they're enemies rather than friends, at doing violence to familiar faces when circumstances require it. Ancient warfare, with its city-state conflicts and civil wars, proved this repeatedly. At perhaps 50 feet apart, both armies stopped advancing simultaneously without any visible signal. It was an instinctive pause, that moment before contact, when both sides took a breath, steadied themselves, prepared for the transition from marching to fighting. Commanders on both sides shouted final encouragements, made last adjustments to formation, ensured everyone was as ready as they could be. Then the Latin line surged forward, and the battle began. The initial contact was brutal and disorienting, as initial contact in ancient battles always was. The front ranks of both armies collided with a tremendous crash, shields hitting shields, spears thrusting forward, men pushing and shoving, and trying to maintain footing, while also trying to kill the person directly in front of them. The noise was overwhelming, the clash of metal on metal, the thud of weapons hitting shields, the shouts and screams of thousands of men all fighting at once. It created a wall of sound that made thinking difficult and communication almost impossible. Commanders could shout orders, but whether anyone heard them over the din was questionable. The Roman front rank locked shields and pushed back against the Latin advance, feet digging into the ground, using their depth to create a wall of resistance. Behind them, the second and third ranks pushed forward, adding their weight to the formation, creating momentum that countered the Latin pressure. This was where Roman discipline and training showed their value. The soldiers maintained formation despite the chaos, despite the fear, despite watching friends fall around them. They held the line not because they were individually braver than the Latins, but because they had drilled this scenario, had practiced holding formation under pressure, had been trained to trust the structure even when instinct said to break and run. The Latin line pressed forward with numerical superiority, trying to use their wider formation to wrap around the Roman flanks, to apply pressure from multiple directions. The Roman right flank held firm, but the left flank began to bend under the weight of Latin attacks, the line curving backward as soldiers gave ground under pressure. This was the critical moment in many ancient battles, when one part of the line started to buckle, when formation began to break, when soldiers had to decide whether to hold their position or fall back to avoid being isolated. The left flank held, barely, but they were clearly struggling, clearly taking heavy casualties, clearly at the edge of breaking. In the center, The fighting was even more intense. This was where the best troops on both sides had been positioned, where the consuls and senior commanders were personally engaged, where the outcome of the battle would likely be determined. The Romans pushed forward in surges, trying to break through the Latin centre. The Latins pushed back, trying to hold their ground and create space for their flanks to envelop the Roman formation. Individual combats within the larger battle were vicious and personal. A Roman soldier would thrust his spear at a Latin opponent, miss or hit the shield, then have to use his sword for close-in fighting. Men grappled with each other, using shields as weapons, punching and kicking when weapons couldn't be brought to bear, doing whatever it took to survive the next few seconds. People fell constantly. Some died immediately. Spear thrusts to the chest or neck, sword cuts that severed arteries, injuries that killed in moments. Others fell wounded but alive, collapsing to the ground where they were trampled by the soldiers still fighting above them, sometimes killed by the trampling, sometimes suffocating under the weight of bodies, sometimes just bleeding out slowly while the battle raged around them. The wounded tried to crawl away from the fighting, dragging themselves backward through the chaos, hoping to reach safety before they bled to death. Some succeeded, many didn't. Ancient battlefields were horrific places for wounded soldiers, who could do nothing but hope they were valuable enough that someone would come back for them after the fighting ended, assuming they survived that long. The Roman consuls fought in the thick of the centre, as was their duty and tradition. They weren't the best fighters. They had been elected for political and administrative skills, not military prowess, but they were competent enough, and their presence inspired the soldiers around them. Roman soldiers fought harder knowing their commanders were sharing the danger, were personally engaged rather than directing from safety. One consul, leading a push forward into the Latin line, suddenly found himself isolated when the soldiers on either side fell and the formation momentarily opened up around him. A Latin soldier saw the opportunity and lunged forward with a spear, aiming for the exposed consul. The thrust would have killed him. Except that a Roman soldier, whose name was not recorded because history often forgets the people who make crucial differences, saw what was happening and threw himself in the way, taking the spear thrust that had been meant for his commander. The soldier fell, mortally wounded, and the consul survived, saved by an act of sacrifice that took perhaps 2 seconds, but changed the battle's trajectory. This kind of thing happened constantly in ancient combat, though usually without anyone noticing or recording it. Small acts of courage or sacrifice, or just being in the right place at the right moment, each one potentially decisive but invisible in the larger chaos of battle. The fighting continued for what felt like hours, but was probably more like 45 minutes. That's about as long as humans can sustain that level of physical exertion and psychological stress. Ancient battles often consisted of multiple phases, intense fighting for a while, then a mutual pause as both sides caught their breath, then renewed fighting, with this pattern repeating until one side finally broke. During one of these pauses, as both armies pulled back slightly to regroup, the Roman commanders assessed the situation, and it wasn't good. The left flank was barely holding, had taken heavy casualties, was clearly on the verge of breaking. The centre was holding but not advancing, locked in stalemate with the Latin centre. The right flank was actually doing well, pushing back their opponents, but that local success wasn't enough to compensate for the problems on the left. Overall, the battle was trending toward Latin victory. The Romans were holding for now, but they were taking more casualties, losing more soldiers, gradually being ground down by superior numbers. If the pattern continued, the Roman line would eventually break, and once an ancient battle line broke, once soldiers started running instead of fighting, defeat became rout, became massacre. "We need to do something," one consul said to the other, both of them breathing hard, both covered in other people's blood. "We can't just hold on and hope, we're losing." "Suggestions?" the other consul replied, "because I'm open to ideas that don't involve dying here." They didn't have many options. They had committed all their forces. There was no reserve to throw in at a crucial moment. They couldn't retreat without turning the withdrawal into a disaster. They couldn't outflank the enemy because the Latins had more soldiers and controlled the flanks. They were essentially stuck, committed to a battle they were slowly losing, with no good way to change the dynamics. "We pray," the first consul said finally. "We fight as hard as we can. We hold as long as possible, and we pray that the gods give us something, anything, that changes this situation. Because right now, we're running out of time and options." It wasn't the most inspiring battle plan ever devised, but it was honest, which counted for something. Sometimes in ancient warfare, as in modern life, you reached the point where all you could do was your best, and hope that external factors, luck, divine intervention, enemy mistakes, worked in your favor. The Roman soldiers on the left flank, meanwhile, were experiencing their own crisis. They had been fighting for an hour now, and they were exhausted. Their officers were dead or wounded. The formation was barely holding together. Men were looking at each other with expressions that said, "How much longer can we do this? And maybe running isn't such a terrible idea." The Latins, sensing weakness, pressed their advantage. They pushed harder on that vulnerable left flank, throwing fresh troops against exhausted Romans, trying to break through and roll up the entire Roman line from the side. The Roman left flank began to give way. Not breaking yet, not fleeing, but definitely losing ground, definitely struggling to maintain any kind of formation, definitely on the edge of collapse. If the left flank broke, the battle was over. The Latins would pour through the gap, attack the Roman centre from the side and rear, and turn an orderly, if losing battle, into a massacre. The Republic would fall. The Tarquins would return. Everything Romans had fought for since the Revolution would be undone. That was the situation, as the battle entered its second hour. Romans losing, slowly but steadily. No reserves to commit. No brilliant tactical moves available. Just exhausted soldiers trying to hold formation, while slowly being overwhelmed by superior numbers. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of desperate situation where Romans would later claim that divine intervention occurred. Whether you believe the gods actually did intervene, or whether the story was created afterward to explain an unlikely victory, or whether something genuinely strange happened that ancient people interpreted as divine, that's up to you. But according to Roman tradition, according to the stories that were told and retold for centuries afterward, this was the moment when Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, decided that Rome needed help, and they were about to provide it in a way that would become one of the most famous legends in Roman military history. What happened next at the Battle of Lake Regillus depends entirely on who you ask and when you ask them. If you asked a Roman historian writing a few centuries later, they would tell you with complete confidence that the divine twins Castor and Pollux personally appeared on the battlefield, fought alongside Roman soldiers, and turned certain defeat into miraculous victory. They would describe these gods in vivid detail: their white horses, their gleaming armor, their superhuman fighting prowess, the way Latin soldiers fell before them like wheat before a scythe. If you asked a skeptical Greek historian from the same era, they might roll their eyes and suggest that Romans had a convenient tendency to attribute military victories to divine intervention, rather than admitting they got lucky, or that their enemies made mistakes. They might point out that gods appeared and saved us is a story that appears in many cultures' military histories, often suspiciously similar to each other. If you asked a modern historian, they would carefully note that the evidence for divine intervention is entirely from Roman sources with obvious bias, that we should approach such claims with appropriate skepticism, but also that something clearly happened at Lake Regillus to shift the battle's momentum, and we can't entirely dismiss the ancient accounts just because they include supernatural elements. And if you asked the Roman soldiers who were actually there, who fought in the battle, and later told stories about it, they would insist with absolute sincerity that they saw what they saw, that two extraordinary warriors on white horses appeared when Rome needed them most, that these warriors fought with strength and skill beyond anything humanly possible, and that their presence changed everything. So what actually happened? Let's acknowledge that we'll never know with certainty. What we can do is tell the story as Romans told it, as it became part of Roman cultural memory, as it shaped how Romans understood themselves and their relationship with the gods. According to Roman tradition, at the moment when the left flank was about to break, when the battle seemed lost and the Republic's survival hung by a thread, two horsemen appeared on the Roman side of the battlefield. They came from the direction of Lake Regillus itself, riding white horses, wearing archaic armor that seemed to glow in the morning sun. They were young men, twins by appearance, strikingly handsome, moving with the kind of fluid grace that marked them as different from ordinary soldiers. They rode straight into the thick of fighting on the collapsing left flank, and they began to fight, and they fought like nothing the Latin soldiers had ever seen. The first thing the Romans noticed was the effect on morale. The left flank soldiers, who moments earlier had been on the verge of breaking, suddenly found renewed strength. The appearance of these two mysterious warriors, whoever they were, created a psychological shift. Reinforcements had arrived. Help was here. They weren't alone anymore. That might seem like a small thing, but in ancient warfare, morale was everything. Battles were won and lost in soldiers' minds as much as on the ground. The side that believed it was losing often did lose, not because they were actually weaker, but because belief in defeat became self-fulfilling. Conversely, A surge of confidence could transform a losing situation into a winning one, purely through the psychological impact on both sides. The two horsemen fought with extraordinary skill and apparent fearlessness. They rode through the Latin lines, their swords rising and falling, every strike precise and devastating. Latin soldiers fell before them, and those who didn't fall backed away, creating space around these impossible warriors. Now there are several possible explanations for what was happening that don't involve actual gods. Possibility 1. The two horsemen were just exceptional human warriors, perhaps Roman cavalry officers or foreign mercenaries with superior training, whose skill level seemed superhuman to soldiers who had been fighting exhausted for hours and were primed to see what they wanted to see. Possibility 2. The appearance of any cavalry reinforcements at that crucial moment would have boosted morale enough to shift the battle, and the details about their superhuman abilities were added later in the retelling, the way stories always get embellished. Possibility 3. It was a case of mistaken identity or mass hallucination. Soldiers under extreme stress seeing what they desperately needed to see, creating a shared experience that everyone later remembered as real. Possibility 4. The gods Castor and Pollux actually did intervene, manifesting physically on the battlefield to save Rome at its moment of greatest need, because that's what gods did in the ancient worldview. They took sides, they intervened, they shaped human events according to their preferences and the prayers they received. Roman soldiers believed the fourth possibility without question. These were Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, sons of Jupiter, protectors of cavalry and warriors, responding to the prayers that soldiers had made the night before. The gods had chosen to save Rome. Whether you believe that or not probably depends on your worldview and your approach to ancient sources. But for the purposes of understanding what happened next, what matters is that everyone on the battlefield, Romans and Latins alike, believed something extraordinary was happening, and that belief shaped their behavior. The Latin soldiers facing the two mysterious horsemen began to pull back, not in organized retreat but in confused withdrawal. These warriors were not normal. They couldn't be hurt, Latin weapons seemed to pass through them or bounce off ineffectively. They didn't tire like normal men, they moved with impossible speed and precision. Fighting them was pointless and terrifying. The psychological impact rippled through the Latin line. Word spread quickly in battle, passed from soldier to soldier. There are gods fighting for Rome. Castor and Pollux are here. We're fighting divine opponents. Now, whether the gods were actually there or not, the belief that they were there was sufficient to change the battle's dynamics. Latin soldiers who had been confident of victory suddenly weren't so sure. Were they on the wrong side? Had the gods favored Rome all along? Was this fight unwinnable? Meanwhile, the Roman soldiers experienced the opposite psychological shift. The gods were with them. Castor and Pollux, divine twins who had been prayed to and promised offerings, had answered those prayers. Victory was not just possible, it was divinely ordained. The Roman left flank, which had been on the verge of collapse moments earlier, stabilized and then began pushing forward. The soldiers fought with renewed vigor, no longer exhausted or frightened, inspired by the presence of the two horsemen who fought alongside them. The two warriors themselves, whether gods or extraordinary humans or something else entirely, continued their devastating work. They rode through the Latin formation, creating chaos wherever they went, breaking up cohesive units, forcing Latin soldiers to scatter or fall back, or simply freeze in confusion. One of the horsemen rode directly at the Latin center, where Octavius Mamilius commanded. Mamilius, to his credit, didn't flee or hide. He was a commander, and commanders didn't abandon their posts, even when facing apparently divine opponents. He raised his sword and prepared to fight. The clash between Mamilius and the divine horseman, assuming it was a god and not just a very skilled warrior, was brief but decisive. According to Roman accounts, Mamilius fought bravely but was quickly unhorsed and seriously wounded. A spear thrust to his side that would eventually kill him, though not immediately. The fall of the Latin commander had profound effects. Ancient armies were commanded personally. The general was right there with the troops, visible, making decisions in real time. When the commander fell, even if he didn't die immediately, it created a leadership vacuum that could paralyze an army's decision-making. The Latin soldiers saw Mamilius fall, saw that their commander was wounded and being carried from the field, and the will to fight began draining from them. Combined with the unnatural terror created by the two mysterious horsemen, with the growing belief that they were fighting against divine opponents, the Latin line began to waver seriously for the first time. The Roman consuls, seeing the shift in momentum, seized the opportunity. They ordered a general advance. every part of the Roman line pushing forward simultaneously, trying to capitalize on Latin confusion and fear before the enemy could recover their composure. The Roman center surged forward with a war cry that could probably be heard all the way back in Rome. These soldiers, who had been locked in stalemate with the Latin center for over an hour, suddenly broke through, scattering the Latin soldiers who had been holding them in place. The right flank, which had been doing well all along, pressed their advantage even harder, driving back their opponents and threatening to envelop the Latin left. And the left flank, recently on the verge of collapse, now pushed forward aggressively, following the lead of the two horsemen who had saved them. The Battle of Lake Regillus, which 20 minutes earlier had seemed like a certain Roman defeat, was rapidly becoming a Roman victory. The Tarquins, watching from their position behind the Latin lines, understood what was happening. They had staked everything on this battle, their last real chance to reclaim Rome, their final opportunity to restore their family's position, and they were losing. The younger Tarquin, sources vary on which one it was, possibly Titus if he had somehow survived earlier reports of his death, possibly another relative entirely, made a desperate decision. He would personally lead a charge at the Roman center, would try to kill one or both consuls, would attempt some dramatic action that might reverse the battle's momentum. It was brave but foolish, the kind of thing people do when they're desperate and out of options. Ancient warfare generally punished dramatic solo heroics. Battles were won by formation and discipline, not by individual champions changing everything through personal combat. The younger Tarquin gathered a group of loyal followers and charged directly at the Roman center, aiming for where the consul's standards marked their position. It was a suicide mission, really. But when you're losing everything anyway, suicide missions start looking more appealing. The charge initially created confusion in the Roman ranks. A sudden concentrated attack from horsemen broke through the line briefly. The Tarquin got close to one of the consuls, close enough to strike at him, close enough that for a moment it looked like he might actually succeed in killing Rome's leader. But the consul's guards intervened, throwing themselves between their commander and the attacker. The Tarquin's horse was brought down, and he fell, surrounded immediately by Roman soldiers who recognized him and understood what killing him would mean. What happened next depends on which account you read. Some sources say the Tarquin was killed on the spot, stabbed repeatedly by Roman soldiers who wanted to personally end the family that had tyrannized Rome. Other sources say he was captured alive and executed shortly afterward. Still others suggest he managed to escape the immediate melee but was mortally wounded and died later. Regardless of the exact details, the important point is that the last significant Tarquin, the last member of the family with any real claim to the throne or ability to lead a restoration movement, was eliminated at the Battle of Lake Regillus. The Tarquin threat, which had hung over the Republic for 12 years, finally ended. The Latin soldiers, seeing both their commander Mamilius wounded and the Tarquin killed or captured, seeing the mysterious horsemen still carving through their ranks, seeing the entire Roman line advancing with renewed vigor, made a collective decision that armies sometimes make. This fight was over. The Latin line broke. Not everywhere at once, but starting from the center where Mamilius had fallen, spreading outward like a crack in ice, until entire units were turning and running, abandoning formation and equipment in their desperation to escape. The Roman soldiers, tasting victory after an hour of desperate fighting, pursued with the kind of vicious energy that comes from surviving something terrifying. They chased the fleeing Latins, cutting down those they caught, creating the kind of massacre that ancient battles became once one side started running. This was the deadliest phase of any ancient battle. Not the initial fighting, where formations protected soldiers and discipline kept casualties relatively low, but the route, where fleeing soldiers were vulnerable and pursuing soldiers were filled with bloodlust and adrenaline. The Latins fled toward their camp, hoping to find safety behind the defensive positions they had established. Some made it, many didn't. The ground between the battlefield and the Latin camp became littered with bodies, wounded men crawling or lying still, abandoned equipment, the detritus of military catastrophe. The two mysterious horsemen, Castor and Pollux, if you believe the Roman accounts, fought throughout this phase of the battle as well, continuing to appear wherever the fighting was thickest, wherever Roman soldiers needed inspiration or Latin resistance needed to be broken. And then, according to Roman tradition, they disappeared. Not gradually, not riding away to somewhere else, but simply vanishing, as mysteriously as they had appeared. One moment they were there, fighting alongside Roman soldiers. The next moment they were gone, leaving only the memory of their presence and the profound impact they had made on the battle's outcome. The Roman soldiers who had fought alongside them were certain about what they had witnessed. These had been gods, not mortal men. Castor and Pollux had come to Rome's aid in its darkest hour, had personally intervened to save the Republic, had proven that the gods favoured Rome's freedom over Tarquin tyranny. Skeptics could argue that the two horsemen were just exceptionally skilled human warriors who happened to arrive at a crucial moment, whose departure wasn't witnessed because everyone was focused on pursuing the fleeing enemy. But the soldiers who were there rejected such skepticism. They knew what they had seen. The gods had fought for Rome. The pursuit continued for several miles, until the Roman commanders finally called it off. Soldiers were exhausted, scattered across the countryside, in danger of being picked off if they pushed too far from mutual support. Better to consolidate the victory than risk turning triumph into disaster through overextension. The Roman army regrouped near the battlefield. As afternoon turned toward evening, they had won. Decisively, surprisingly, miraculously, however you wanted to characterize it, they had won. The Latin League's army was shattered, fleeing in disorder back toward their various cities. The Tarquin threat was eliminated. The Republic was safe, but the cost had been high. Thousands of Romans lay dead or wounded on the battlefield. The left flank, which had borne the brunt of Latin attacks, had suffered particularly heavy casualties. Every Roman family would know someone who hadn't come home from Lake Regillus. The consuls walked through the aftermath, observing the carnage, trying to process what had just happened. One of them voiced the question that many were thinking. Did we actually just see what we think we saw? Were those really Castor and Pollux? I don't know, the other consul replied honestly. But I know that we were losing, and then they appeared, and then we won. Whether they were gods or just extraordinary warriors, I'm grateful they were on our side. We should build a temple, the first consul said, to honor Castor and Pollux, to thank them for their intervention. If the gods helped save Rome, Rome should acknowledge that debt. It was a practical proposal. Romans believed in transactional relationships with gods. You made offerings, you built temples, you showed gratitude, and in return the gods continued to favor you. If Castor and Pollux had helped Rome win at Lake Regillus, then Rome owed them recognition and thanks. The Senate would later approve the construction of a temple to Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum, which would become one of the city's most important religious sites. But that was for later. Right now, the immediate priority was dealing with the aftermath of battle, collecting the wounded, burying the dead, securing the victory they had won. As night fell over Lake Regillus, the Roman army made camp on the battlefield they had held. Soldiers collapsed in exhaustion, too tired to even celebrate their victory properly. Medical personnel moved among the wounded, doing what they could with ancient medicine's limited resources. Burial details began the grim work of dealing with the dead, and somewhere, allegedly, 2 divine horsemen rode away from the battlefield, their work completed, leaving Rome to secure its own future, now that they had ensured it would have one. The day after the Battle of Lake Regillus was spent doing the unglamorous work that follows every ancient battle, dealing with the dead, treating the wounded, and trying to figure out exactly what had just happened, and what it meant for the future. The Roman dead numbered somewhere around 3,000. Though ancient casualty figures are notoriously unreliable, that's about a quarter of the army that had marched out from Rome just days earlier. A devastating loss by any measure, though it could have been worse if the battle had been lost. If the Latin pursuit had been vigorous, casualties could easily have been twice that number or more. The wounded numbered at least that many again. Ancient warfare produced a lot of wounded soldiers, and most of them wouldn't survive their injuries. Ancient medicine was primitive by modern standards, effective at treating minor wounds but largely helpless against serious injuries, infections, or internal damage. The soldier who took a spear thrust to the abdomen or a sword cut that severed major blood vessels was almost certainly going to die, just slowly and painfully rather than immediately. The Roman army established a field hospital of sorts, a designated area where the wounded were brought for whatever treatment could be provided. The physicians, such as they were, more like experienced medics than trained doctors, did what they could. They cleaned wounds, applied bandages, set broken bones, gave poppy juice for pain, but mostly they just triaged, separating the soldiers who might survive from those who definitely wouldn't, focusing limited resources where they might actually do some good. Walking through the field hospital was a sobering experience for anyone who had fought in the battle. These weren't abstract casualties or numbers in a report. They were people you knew, fellow soldiers, neighbors, friends, relatives. Some were conscious and in pain, moaning or crying, or trying desperately to maintain stoic dignity. Others were unconscious, either from blood loss or from whatever pain remedies had been administered. Still others were somewhere in between, delirious from fever or shock, mumbling incoherently. The burial details had the even grimmer task of dealing with the dead. Ancient practice was to burn bodies on funeral pyres, rather than bury them intact. This served both practical purposes, reducing the bodies to manageable remains, and religious purposes, releasing the soul from the physical form. But with thousands of dead to process, individual pyres weren't practical. Mass cremations were organised instead, with bodies burned in large groups, the ashes collected for eventual return to families. It was gruesome work, the kind that stays with you. The soldiers assigned to burial details would spend hours handling corpses, arranging bodies on pyres, tending the fires, dealing with the smell and sight and awful intimacy of death on that scale. They'd carry those memories for the rest of their lives, would wake up years later from nightmares about Lake Regillus and the day after the battle. The Latin dead were treated with less ceremony. The Romans allowed Latin survivors to collect their own dead for proper cremation, which was considered decent and honourable by ancient standards. But the Romans didn't expend their own resources on enemy casualties. The Latins had to organise their own burial details, their own pyres, their own rituals. The Latin army's remnants had withdrawn several miles from the battlefield, setting up a defensive camp where they could regroup and assess their situation. They had been decisively defeated, had lost their commander, had seen their cause literally die on the battlefield when the last Tarquin fell, but they were still a military force, still needed to organise themselves enough to withdraw safely back to their various cities. The Romans, meanwhile, were trying to understand what had actually happened during the battle, particularly regarding the two mysterious horsemen who had appeared at the critical moment. Everyone who had fought on the left flank had stories about them, about their white horses, their gleaming armour, their impossible fighting prowess, the way they had appeared when needed most and then vanished when the battle was won. They were gods. One soldier insisted to anyone who would listen. "I saw them up close. No mortal man fights like that. Those were Castor and Pollux, I'm certain of it." "You were exhausted and scared," a more sceptical soldier replied. "You saw what you wanted to see. Probably just two really good cavalry officers who happened to show up at the right time. Then, where did they go? Why didn't they stay for the aftermath? Why didn't anyone see them ride away? I don't know. Maybe we were all too busy chasing the Latins to notice them leaving. Doesn't mean they were gods." These debates would continue for years, probably for centuries. Romans loved arguing about whether divine intervention was real, or whether natural explanations sufficed. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle, most soldiers were inclined to believe the supernatural explanation. They had prayed for divine help. Help had arrived at exactly the right moment, in exactly the form needed. That seemed like more than coincidence. The consuls, meanwhile, had more practical concerns than theological debates. They needed to secure the victory, deal with the Latin League's remnants, and get their army safely back to Rome. Victories could be squandered if mishandled in the aftermath, and the consuls were determined not to let that happen. They sent envoys to the Latin camp, offering reasonable terms for ending the conflict. The Latins could withdraw peacefully back to their cities. There would be no pursuit, no sacking of Latin towns, no punitive measures beyond what the battlefield had already imposed. In return, the Latin League would acknowledge defeat, would agree to Rome's continued independence and republican government, and would surrender any remaining Tarquin family members or supporters who might be in their camps, the Latin commanders. What was left of their leadership after Mamilius's mortal wounding accepted these terms. They had no real choice. Their army was broken, their morale shattered, their cause lost. Trying to continue fighting would just mean more casualties for no purpose. Better to accept generous terms while Rome was offering them. The agreement was formalized with oaths and rituals, the kind of sacred promises that ancient people took seriously because they believed the gods enforced them. Both sides swore to uphold the terms, called upon various deities to witness the agreement, threatened divine punishment for anyone who violated the peace. With that settled, the Roman army began its return march to Rome, moving slowly because of the wounded and the exhausted soldiers who could barely walk after 2 days of marching and fighting. They carried their dead with them, or at least the ashes from the mass cremations, to be returned to families for final burial rites. The march back took most of a day. The army that had left Rome 3 days earlier, confident and organised, now returned depleted and exhausted but victorious. News of the victory had preceded them. Scouts had ridden ahead to announce the outcome, so Romans knew they had won before they saw the returning soldiers. But here's where the story gets interesting, where the legend of Castor and Pollux takes another strange turn. According to Roman tradition, on the same day as the battle, In the late afternoon, while the fighting at Lake Regillus was still ongoing or had just concluded, two young men on white horses appeared in the Roman Forum. They rode up to the Temple of Vesta, which stood near the center of the city, dismounted, and allowed their horses to drink from the spring that flowed near the temple. The two young men were covered in dust and showed signs of recent combat. Blood on their armor, dirt on their faces, the unmistakable appearance of men who had just been in a serious fight. They were strikingly handsome, identical twins, wearing armor that seemed somehow archaic, not quite matching the current Roman military style. People in the Forum noticed them, of course. Two warriors appearing mysteriously in the city center, looking like they had just come from battle, riding magnificent white horses. This wasn't something you could miss. A crowd gathered, asking questions. Who were these men? Where had they come from? What battle had they been fighting? The two men smiled, but didn't answer directly. Instead, they announced to the assembled crowd, "Rome has won a great victory at Lake Regillus. The Latin League has been defeated. The Tarquins are finished. The Republic is safe." The crowd was skeptical. How could these strangers know the outcome of a battle that was happening 20 miles away? Even with fast horses, news couldn't travel that quickly. The battle had been ongoing, or had just ended. There was no way messengers could have reached Rome already. "Who told you this?" someone in the crowd asked. "How do you know what happened at Lake Regillus?" The two men exchanged a knowing look, then replied, "We know because we were there. We fought in the battle." Before anyone could ask more questions, before the crowd could fully process this impossible claim, the two men remounted their white horses and rode away. They disappeared into the city, and despite efforts to follow them or find out where they went, they seemed to simply vanish. No one could locate them afterward. No one knew where they had gone. Hours later, when the official scouts arrived with confirmed news of the victory, when the details matched exactly what the two mysterious men had announced, Romans began to understand what had happened. Those had been Castor and Pollux. The divine twins had appeared first on the battlefield at Lake Regillus, fighting alongside Roman soldiers, and then had appeared in Rome itself to announce the victory they had helped achieve. It was an impossible story, of course. The laws of physics don't allow for people to be in two places at once, to fight in a battle 20 miles away, and then appear in Rome to announce the victory before any normal messenger could arrive. Even with divine powers, it strained credibility, but Romans believed it. Not because they were foolish or superstitious, but because it fit with their understanding of how gods worked. Castor and Pollux were protectors of cavalry and warriors, were known for helping those who called upon them, were famous in Greek and Roman mythology for appearing when needed, that they would manifest physically to save Rome at its moment of greatest danger, that they would then appear in the city itself to announce the victory, made perfect sense in the ancient worldview. The Temple of Vesta, where the twins had allegedly appeared, immediately became a sacred site associated with their intervention. The spring where their horses had drunk became a place where people came to pray to Castor and Pollux, to thank them for saving Rome, to ask for their continued protection. When the Roman army returned to the city the next day, the soldiers who had fought on the left flank confirmed the story. Yes, two divine warriors on white horses had appeared at the critical moment. Yes, they had fought with superhuman skill and courage. Yes, they had disappeared mysteriously after the battle. The appearance in the Forum wasn't a separate incident. It was the same two beings, the same divine twins, appearing to Romans in the city just as they had appeared to Romans on the battlefield. The coincidence was too perfect, too synchronized, to be anything but divine intervention. The gods had saved Rome. Castor and Pollux had personally intervened to preserve the Republic. That was the explanation Romans accepted, and it would be repeated and believed for centuries afterward. Modern historians approach this story with appropriate skepticism. Maybe the two men in the Forum were just travelers who had happened to guess correctly about the battle's outcome. Maybe the whole thing was made up later to create a founding myth for the temple that would eventually be built to Castor and Pollux. Maybe there's a rational explanation that we just can't see from our distant historical perspective. But maybe, Ines, and this is where it gets philosophically interesting, maybe the Romans were right. Maybe gods do intervene in human affairs when properly invoked. Maybe Castor and Pollux did save Rome at Lake Regillus. We can't prove they didn't, any more than we can prove they did. The rational materialist explanation and the supernatural explanation both require acts of faith, just different kinds of faith. What we can say with certainty is that something happened at Lake Regillus that shifted the battle's momentum at exactly the right moment. Whether that something was divine intervention, lucky timing, exceptional human warriors, mass hallucination, or something else entirely, the effect was the same. Rome won a battle it had been losing, eliminated the Tarquin threat permanently, and secured the Republic's survival. The Roman army's return to the city was met with mixed emotions. Joy at the victory, relief that the Tarquin threat was over, gratitude that the Republic had survived, but also grief for the thousands who hadn't come home, mourning for the sons and fathers and brothers whose ashes were all that returned from Lake Regillus. The city declared a period of public thanksgiving to the gods, particularly to Castor and Pollux. Sacrifices were made, prayers were offered, promises were given. The Senate voted to build a temple to the divine twins in the Forum, on or near the spot where they had allegedly appeared to announce the victory. This temple would become one of Rome's most important religious sites, a lasting monument to divine intervention and military victory. The captured or surrendered Tarquin supporters were dealt with according to Roman law and custom. Those who had actively fought against Rome were executed. Those who had simply been in the Latin camps but hadn't personally taken up arms were allowed to go into exile. The Romans were harsh but not indiscriminate in their retributions. The body of the last Tarquin, whichever family member had led the final charge at Lake Regillus, was treated with a certain amount of respect despite his status as enemy and traitor. Romans believed in honoring the dead, even enemy dead, even when those enemies had tried to destroy the Republic. The body was cremated with appropriate rituals, the ashes given to whatever Tarquin relatives still existed in exile. It was a strange moment of magnanimity, treating the remains of someone who had tried to overthrow your government with dignity and respect. But it demonstrated something important about Roman values. They could be ruthlessly practical in warfare and politics, but they also respected certain boundaries, certain principles that transcended immediate conflicts. The Latin League, meanwhile, was dealing with its own aftermath. The coalition had been thoroughly defeated, had lost thousands of soldiers, had seen its military ambitions crushed. The various Latin cities had to decide how to respond, how to relate to Rome now that the power balance had shifted so decisively. Most chose accommodation over continued resistance. They sent envoys to Rome offering peace, proposing treaties that acknowledged Roman dominance while preserving Latin autonomy in internal affairs. Rome accepted these overtures, choosing to be magnanimous in victory rather than vindictive. The Republic needed allies more than it needed resentful, conquered peoples. A few Latin cities resisted, tried to maintain their hostility to Rome, refused to acknowledge defeat. These cities would eventually be conquered or coerced into submission, but that was work for another year, another campaign. For now, Rome was content to have eliminated the immediate threat and secured its position in Latium. In the days following the army's return, Rome began processing what the victory meant. The Tarquin threat, which had hung over the Republic since its founding, was finally definitively over. No more exiled kings plotting restoration. No more foreign armies marching on Rome to reinstall monarchy. The Republic was secure, proven viable, validated by military victory and apparent divine favor. This was psychologically important for Romans. The Republic had been an experiment, a radical innovation that many had doubted could survive. 12 years of successful self-government had been impressive but not conclusive. Foreign powers like Porcento had seemed to respect Rome's choice more out of pragmatism than genuine acceptance. But the victory at Lake Regillus, especially with the divine intervention story attached to it, felt different. This wasn't just Rome surviving. It was Rome being chosen by the gods, being validated by divine powers, being marked as special and worthy of protection. The Republic wasn't just a political arrangement anymore. It was sacred, blessed, ordained by divine will. That might seem like a stretch, like Romans were reading too much into a military victory. But ancient people didn't separate politics and religion the way modern people often do. Divine favor was real, was important, was one of the primary ways you knew whether your government and society were functioning correctly. If the gods helped you win battles, that meant you were doing something right. The construction of the Temple of Castor and Pollux would take several years to complete. Temples in ancient Rome weren't quick projects. They required extensive planning, skilled craftsmen, expensive materials, religious rituals at every stage of construction. But the process began immediately, with the Senate allocating funds and selecting a prominent location in the Forum. The temple would eventually become one of Rome's architectural landmarks, a beautiful building with tall columns and elaborate decorations. But more than just a building, it would be a statement. Rome was protected by the gods. The Republic had divine sanction. Anyone who challenged Rome challenged not just human soldiers but divine powers. As the immediate aftermath of the battle faded into routine, as life in Rome returned to something like normalcy, the soldiers who had fought at Lake Regillus became celebrities of a sort. Everyone wanted to hear their stories. especially stories about the divine twins who had appeared at the critical moment. Veterans of the battle would spend years telling and retelling those stories, each time perhaps adding a small detail, emphasizing certain aspects, gradually transforming personal memory into cultural mythology. This is how legends are created. Not through deliberate invention, but through repeated telling. Each retelling shaping the story slightly, emphasizing the dramatic and supernatural elements, smoothing out the confusing parts, until what remains is a narrative that feels true, even if it's no longer strictly factual. The Battle of Lake Regillus had been won. The Tarquins were finished. The Republic was safe, and Castor and Pollux had become Rome's special protectors, divine guardians who had proven their devotion to Roman freedom. What happened next? How the victory shaped Rome's relationship with its neighbours. How the Republic continued to develop. How the memory of Lake Regillus influenced Roman culture. That was the long-term legacy that would unfold over the following decades and centuries. But in the immediate aftermath, in those days and weeks after the battle, Romans simply celebrated their survival. They had faced an existential threat and won. They had been tested and proven themselves worthy. The Republic would endure, blessed by the gods and defended by free citizens willing to fight for their freedom. That was enough. For now, the rest would come later. The weeks following the Battle of Lake Regillus were occupied with the tedious but necessary work of converting military victory into political stability. Wars might be won on battlefields, but peace had to be negotiated in meeting rooms, through careful diplomacy and practical compromise, and the kind of patient discussion that soldiers generally found much more boring than actual combat. The Latin League, having been decisively defeated, was in no position to negotiate from strength. But Rome, despite its victory, also had reasons to prefer diplomacy over continued warfare. The battle had cost Rome heavily: 3,000 dead, thousands more wounded, economic disruption from the military mobilization. Fighting every Latin city individually would be ruinously expensive, both in lives and resources. Better to achieve through negotiation what might otherwise require years of grinding warfare. The Romans and Latins met at a location neutral to both sides, a small temple to Jupiter about halfway between Rome and the nearest significant Latin city. Neutral religious sites were commonly used for diplomatic meetings in the ancient world, because the sacred nature of the location supposedly constrained both sides from violence or treachery. Whether the gods actually enforced this or whether it was just mutually agreed fiction didn't matter. It created a space where negotiations could happen. The Roman delegation was led by one of the consuls, accompanied by several senior senators who had experience in foreign relations. The Latin delegation consisted of representatives from the major cities in the League, each speaking for their own city, but also trying to coordinate with the others to present a united front. The negotiations took days, as these things always did. Every point had to be debated. Every term had to be acceptable to multiple parties. Every agreement had to be phrased carefully to avoid future disputes about interpretation. The basic framework was relatively straightforward. Rome would not conquer or occupy Latin territory. The Latin cities would retain their autonomy in internal affairs. In exchange, the Latin League would acknowledge Roman leadership in external matters, particularly military affairs. When Rome went to war with outside enemies, the Latin cities would be expected to contribute troops. When Rome negotiated treaties with foreign powers, those treaties would apply to the Latin League as well. It was what would later be called a hegemonic system. One power dominant but not directly controlling others, exercising leadership through a combination of military superiority and negotiated arrangements. Rome would use this model repeatedly in its expansion. Finding it more effective than trying to directly administer conquered territories, the Latin representatives tried to negotiate better terms. Naturally, they argued that the battle had been close, that defeat didn't justify complete subordination, that Latin autonomy should extend to military decisions, as well as internal governance. The Romans, having won the battle, were less sympathetic to these arguments, but also pragmatic enough to make some concessions. The final treaty, eventually agreed upon and ratified by both Rome's Senate and the individual Latin city governments, established several important principles. First, mutual defense. If Rome was attacked, the Latin cities would help defend it. If any Latin city was attacked, Rome would help defend it. This created a genuine alliance rather than just Roman dominance. Gave the Latins some benefit in exchange for acknowledging Roman leadership. Second, trade and movement. Citizens of Rome and the Latin cities could travel, trade and own property in each other's territories without restriction. This economic integration would bind the region together through practical self-interest rather than just political agreements. Third, Dispute resolution. Conflicts between Rome and Latin cities, or between different Latin cities, would be resolved through arbitration rather than warfare. A panel of judges drawn from both Roman and Latin cities would hear cases and make binding decisions. This wasn't perfect. The judges would probably favour their own sides, but it was better than constant small wars. Fourth, no independent foreign policy. The Latin cities couldn't make treaties or alliances with foreign powers without Roman approval. This was the key Roman demand, the thing they insisted on as the price of not conquering the Latin cities outright. Rome would control external relations for the entire region. It was a reasonable treaty from both perspectives, which meant neither side was entirely happy with it. The Romans would have preferred more direct control, the Latins would have preferred more autonomy, but both sides recognized that continuing conflict was worse than accepting a compromise neither loved. The treaty was solemnized with elaborate religious ceremonies, because ancient people believed that involving the gods made agreements more binding. Both sides swore oaths calling on Jupiter, Mars, and various other deities to witness the treaty and punish any violations. Animals were sacrificed, their entrails examined for omens, all the usual rituals that made diplomatic agreements feel sacred rather than just practical. With the treaty concluded, Rome's external situation improved dramatically. The Latin League, which had been a potential threat, was now an alliance. The Tarquins, who had been a constant source of instability, were eliminated. The neighbouring powers, who had been watching Rome's republican experiment with skepticism, now had to acknowledge that the Republic had proven itself militarily viable. This diplomatic success was at least as important as the military victory that preceded it. Rome had won battles before, but failed to convert those victories into stable peace. This time the consuls and senate managed both the warfare and the diplomacy effectively, creating a regional order that would last for generations. But peace with external enemies didn't mean Rome was without problems. Internal tensions that had been set aside during the crisis of the Tarquin threat now resurfaced, demanding attention. The fundamental tension in the early Republic was between patricians and plebeians, between the old aristocratic families who had dominated Roman society under the kings, and continued to dominate under the Republic, and the common citizens who had been promised equality and participation but often felt excluded from real power. The patricians controlled the Senate, held most of the magistracies, owned most of the land. They were, in effect, a hereditary aristocracy that the revolution hadn't really disturbed. Yes, Rome had gotten rid of the king, but it had replaced royal power with patrician power, which from a plebeian perspective wasn't necessarily a huge improvement. The plebeians had fought at Lake Regillus. They had bled and died for the Republic. They had proven their loyalty and courage, and now they were returning home to find that while they were risking their lives for Rome, patrician landowners had been buying up plebeian farms at bargain prices, that plebeian families had gone into debt, that the economic and social hierarchy that favoured patricians over plebeians remained unchanged. This created resentment, naturally, the kind of resentment that builds slowly, that isn't always visible on the surface, but that can eventually explode into serious political crisis. The victory at Lake Regillus had papered over these tensions temporarily. Nothing unites a society like external threat. When the Tarquins were trying to destroy the Republic, patricians and plebeians had common cause. But with that threat eliminated, with Rome secure and stable, the internal contradictions of Republican society became more apparent. Plebeian soldiers came home to find themselves in debt, their farms neglected during their military service, their families struggling. The compensation for military service was minimal. Rome didn't pay its soldiers, expected citizens to serve without monetary reward, because defending the city was a civic duty. But civic duty didn't feed families or pay debts or compensate for lost farming time. Some patricians recognized this as a problem, understood that asking citizens to fight for Rome while ignoring their economic struggles was unsustainable. They proposed reforms, debt relief for soldiers, distribution of captured land to plebeian families, perhaps a small stipend for military service. Other patricians opposed such reforms vigorously. They argued that the Republic was working fine, that plebeians should be grateful for the opportunity to serve Rome, that economic hierarchy was natural and proper, that redistributing wealth or providing benefits to soldiers would undermine social order and bankrupt the state. These debates in the Senate became increasingly heated. The patrician reformers were accused of pandering to plebeians, of undermining traditional values, of being soft and weak. The patrician conservatives were accused of being selfish, of caring more about their own wealth than about Rome's soldiers, of risking social upheaval through their inflexibility. The plebeians themselves, meanwhile, were organizing. Not in any formal political sense yet, That would come later, in the first seconation just a few years down the road, but in informal gatherings, in conversations, in the kind of grassroots political activity that happens when people feel excluded from formal power structures. They talked about their grievances, compared notes on patrician landlords and creditors, discussed what they could do to force the patrician-dominated government to pay attention to their concerns. These conversations were the seeds of the great class struggle that would define Roman politics for the next 2 centuries. For now, though, in the immediate aftermath of Lake Regillus, these tensions remained mostly beneath the surface. The victory had created a period of good feeling, of shared pride in Roman achievement, that temporarily muted internal conflicts. The Republic had survived its greatest external test. That was worth celebrating, even if questions remained about who actually benefited from the Republic's survival. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, meanwhile, was progressing from planning to actual construction. The Senate had allocated substantial funds, recognizing that a temple to the gods who had saved Rome needed to be impressive, needed to reflect Rome's gratitude and piety. The location chosen was prominent, right in the Roman Forum, the center of civic life, where everyone would see it and be reminded of divine intervention. The design was Greek-influenced, with tall columns and elaborate decoration, reflecting Rome's increasing engagement with Greek culture and architecture. Greek cities had been building beautiful temples for centuries. Romans, coming later to monumental architecture, learned from Greek examples while trying to develop their own distinctive style. The Temple of Castor and Pollux would be recognizably Greek in its basic form, but Roman in its details, in the way it integrated into the forum's civic space rather than standing isolated like many Greek temples. The construction employed hundreds of workers: stonemasons, carpenters, painters, sculptors. It provided jobs, stimulated the economy, gave Rome's craftsmen a major project to demonstrate their skills. Temples weren't just religious buildings in the ancient world. They were economic engines, prestige projects, demonstrations of a city's wealth and power. The work would take years to complete. Ancient construction was slow, limited by available technology and the sheer physical labor required to move and shape heavy stone without modern machinery. But the process itself was meaningful, each stage accompanied by religious rituals, each step bringing Rome closer to properly honoring the gods who had saved the Republic. Priests of Castor and Pollux, a cult that became increasingly prominent in Rome after Lake Regillus, performed ceremonies at the construction site, blessing the work, ensuring divine approval for the temple being built in the gods' honor. The priests told and retold the story of the battle, of the divine intervention, of the mysterious appearance in the Forum, keeping the memory fresh and vivid for Romans who hadn't been there. This storytelling was important for maintaining the temple's significance. The temple was just a building, unless people remembered why it had been built, what it commemorated, what divine relationship it represented. The priests made sure Romans didn't forget that Castor and Pollux had saved the Republic, had personally fought for Roman freedom, deserved eternal gratitude and worship. Veterans of Lake Regillus became frequent visitors to the temple site, even while it was still under construction. They came to pray, to make offerings, to thank the gods who had saved them when the battle seemed lost. Some left small votive offerings, bronze figurines, painted tablets, weapons captured from Latin enemies. These accumulated at the construction site, creating a kind of spontaneous shrine even before the formal temple was complete. The cult of Castor and Pollux also expanded beyond just those who had fought at Lake Regillus. Roman cavalry, recognizing the twins as divine patrons of horsemen, adopted them as special protectors. Young men seeking military glory prayed to Castor and Pollux for courage and success. Families with twins, seeing divine twins as protective figures for their own children, made offerings at the temple site. This broadening of the cult's appeal helped ensure the temple's long-term significance. It wasn't just a memorial to one battle, but a living religious center serving multiple constituencies, addressing ongoing spiritual needs rather than just commemorating past events. The Senate, watching the temple's construction and the growing cult around it, recognized an opportunity. The victory at Lake Regillus and the divine intervention story had given Rome something valuable, a narrative of divine favor, a story that distinguished Rome from other cities, a legend that explained why Rome had survived and prospered. Other cities had founding myths, stories about their origins and special relationships with gods. But Rome now had a recent miracle, living memory of divine intervention, veterans who could personally testify to what they had seen. This was powerful propaganda, a way to claim that Rome wasn't just another Italian city, but a place specially chosen and protected by the gods. The Senate encouraged this narrative, not cynically, but because they believed it themselves and recognized its value for Roman morale and international prestige. When foreign ambassadors visited Rome, they were taken to the temple construction site, told the story of Lake Regillus, shown the place where Castor and Pollux had appeared. When Rome negotiated treaties, the story of divine favor was mentioned, implying that opposing Rome meant opposing gods who had already proven willing to intervene on Rome's behalf. This wasn't dishonest, exactly. Romans genuinely believed their own propaganda, but it was also strategically useful, a way to leverage religious belief for political benefit. Ancient religion and politics were never really separate, and the temple of Castor and Pollux was as much a political statement as a religious one. As the first anniversary of the Battle of Lake Regillus approached, Rome organized commemorative ceremonies. Veterans gathered to remember fallen comrades, to retell battle stories, to honor the gods who had saved them. The Senate declared an official day of thanksgiving, with public sacrifices and feasting, celebrating both military victory and divine intervention. These commemorations would become annual traditions, eventually expanding into a festival dedicated to Castor and Pollux. Every year Romans would remember Lake Regillus, would tell the stories to children who hadn't been born when the battle was fought, would maintain the memory of divine intervention and republican victory. This kind of ritualized remembering served important social functions. It created shared identity, gave Romans a common story about who they were and why their city mattered. It reinforced the legitimacy of the Republic by connecting it to divine favor. It honored the dead by ensuring they weren't forgotten, and it reminded each generation that freedom required sacrifice, that the Republic had been defended by ordinary citizens willing to fight and die for it. The Latin cities, meanwhile, were adjusting to their new relationship with Rome. Some found the arrangement satisfactory. Roman leadership meant protection and stability, access to trade networks, participation in a successful alliance. Others resented their diminished autonomy, chafed under Roman dominance, looked for opportunities to reassert independence. These tensions would persist for generations, occasionally flaring into conflict but generally managed through the diplomatic framework established after Lake Regillus. Rome had learned an important lesson. Conquered peoples could be managed through alliances and shared interests better than through direct force. This insight would guide Roman expansion for centuries. The former Tarquin supporters who had survived the battle and its aftermath mostly faded into obscurity. A few went into permanent exile, moving to distant cities where their past wouldn't follow them. Others stayed in Latium but abandoned politics, living quietly on family estates, trying to forget that they had once backed the losing side in a struggle for Rome's soul. The Tarquin family name itself became toxic in Rome, associated with tyranny and betrayal. Future Romans would use Tarquin as an insult, would invoke the name when they wanted to accuse someone of aspiring to monarchy or oppressing the people. The family that had given Rome 2 kings would be remembered primarily for giving Rome reasons to distrust royal power. This anti-monarchical sentiment, reinforced by the Tarquin story and the victory at Lake Regillus, became fundamental to Roman identity. Romans defined themselves partly by what they weren't. They weren't subjects, weren't ruled by kings, weren't willing to tolerate tyranny. This negative definition, freedom defined as absence of monarchy, rather than presence of specific rights, would shape Roman political culture for centuries. As the year 496 BC drew to a close, as Romans prepared for consular elections and the transition to a new political season, they could look back on an extraordinary 12 months. They had faced an existential threat from the Latin League and the Tarquins. They had won a seemingly miraculous military victory. They had negotiated a favorable peace that enhanced Rome's regional position. They had begun construction of a temple that would become one of their city's landmarks. The Republic had survived not just in the minimal sense of not being overthrown, but in the stronger sense of proving itself viable and legitimate. It had defeated external enemies, maintained internal cohesion, managed the transition from crisis to stability. Future Romans would look back on 496 BC as the year when the Republic truly came of age, when it transitioned from uncertain experiment to proven system. The new consuls, elected for 495 BC, would face different challenges, primarily internal rather than external, primarily about managing plebeian discontent rather than fighting foreign armies. But they would face those challenges from a position of strength, with a republic that had proven it could survive and prosper, with divine favor apparently secured, with regional dominance established. Lake Regillus had been Rome's Valley Forge moment, the desperate battle that tested whether the revolutionary government could actually survive serious military pressure. Rome had passed that test, partly through military skill, partly through discipline and courage, and partly, if you believed the stories, through divine intervention that saved the Republic at its darkest moment. Whether the gods had actually intervened or whether something else had happened that ancient people interpreted as divine didn't ultimately matter. What mattered was that Rome survived, that the Republic endured, that free citizens defending their freedom had proven themselves capable of defeating professional armies and external threats. The rest? The long story of Roman expansion, of empire, of centuries of history that would follow, all built on this foundation, on the proof at Lake Regillus that the Republic was viable and worth defending. The age of the Tarquins was over. The age of the Republic continued, and Romans, for the first time since their revolution, could truly believe that their experiment in self-government had succeeded. The years immediately following the Battle of Lake Regillus saw Rome transform from a city defending its revolutionary government to a regional power confident in its strength and legitimacy. It was a subtle shift, the kind that you only notice by comparing before and after, rather than watching the gradual change, but it was profound nonetheless. Before Lake Regillus, Rome had been reactive, responding to threats, defending against attacks, trying to survive external pressure from those who wanted to see the Republic fail. After Lake Regillus, Rome became proactive, making strategic decisions about regional politics, projecting power beyond its immediate territory, acting like a power that expected to shape events rather than just respond to them. This transformation wasn't instantaneous, wasn't the result of one battle alone, but Lake Regillus was the turning point. The moment when Rome's self-conception shifted from vulnerable republic fighting for survival to legitimate government with divine favor and military capability. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which was finally completed and dedicated in 484 BC, about 12 years after the battle it commemorated. 12 years might seem like a long time for a construction project, but ancient temples weren't built quickly. They required precision work, expensive materials, skilled craftsmen, and elaborate religious ceremonies at every stage of construction. The completed temple was magnificent. 3 tall columns on the front, only 3 because of space constraints in the forum, where real estate was extremely valuable. Beautiful marble work, a statue of the divine twins inside. The whole structure painted in bright colors that have long since faded but would have been eye-catching in ancient Rome. The temple's dedication ceremony was a major event. Veterans of Lake Regillus, now middle-aged men with grey in their hair and grandchildren at their feet, gathered to witness the completion of the monument they had been promised 12 years earlier. Some wept openly, remembering friends who had died in the battle, remembering the terror and desperation of that day, feeling grateful that their sacrifice had been honored with this beautiful building. The ceremony included sacrifices, bulls and sheep, expensive offerings appropriate for major gods. The priests recited prayers thanking Castor and Pollux for their intervention, asking for continued divine favor, promising ongoing worship and respect. The consuls made speeches about divine favor and republican virtue, and Rome's special relationship with the gods. And then the temple was officially opened, available for worship, ready to serve as both religious site and civic monument. It immediately became one of Rome's most important buildings, not just for religious reasons but for political ones. The Senate sometimes met there. Public announcements were made from its steps. It served as a backdrop for important events, lending divine associations to political activities. The temple's message was clear. Rome was protected by gods, favored by divine powers, special among Italian cities. This wasn't just propaganda. Romans genuinely believed it. But it was also strategically valuable propaganda, the kind that enhanced Rome's prestige and intimidated potential enemies. Foreign ambassadors visiting Rome were invariably taken to the Temple of Castor and Pollux, shown the beautiful building, told the story of divine intervention at Lake Regillus. The implicit message was unmistakable. Opposing Rome meant opposing gods who had already demonstrated willingness to intervene directly in warfare. That was a sobering thought for any city considering challenging Roman power. The treaty with the Latin League, meanwhile, had held remarkably well. There were occasional disputes, disagreements about troop contributions, arguments about trade terms, tensions over boundaries and resource allocation. But these were managed through the arbitration system established in the treaty, resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. This was novel, actually. Ancient Italian cities had traditionally settled disputes through force, or at least through the implicit threat of force. The idea that you could have formal systems for resolving conflicts peacefully, that you could prefer arbitration to warfare, represented a kind of diplomatic innovation that would become characteristic of Roman regional management. Rome's approach wasn't purely benevolent. They were establishing and maintaining dominance, not creating some kind of ancient United Nations, but Roman dominance, was exercised partly through institutions and procedures rather than just through military force. This made Roman leadership more palatable to subject cities and more sustainable over time. The Latin cities found that alliance with Rome brought benefits beyond just peace. Roman military power provided protection against external threats, particularly against the Volsci and Aqui, mountain peoples who periodically raided lowland cities. Roman trade networks provided economic opportunities. Roman legal systems offered frameworks for resolving commercial disputes. Being part of the Roman alliance meant being part of a successful regional order. Not all Latins were happy about this. Naturally, there were always factions that resented Roman dominance, that wanted to reassert independence, that felt their cities had lost something essential in submitting to Rome's leadership. These discontents occasionally bubbled to the surface in various forms: political movements within Latin cities, diplomatic maneuvering, occasional small-scale conflicts. But overall, the system established after Lake Regillus worked. It created regional stability, allowed economic development, prevented the kind of constant warfare that had characterized earlier periods. Romans could look at Latium and see a region that, while not perfectly peaceful, was more orderly and prosperous under Roman leadership than it had been under competing city-states. This success in managing the Latin alliance taught Rome lessons that would prove valuable in future expansion. You could control territories through alliances and shared interests rather than direct occupation. You could allow local autonomy in internal affairs while maintaining control over external relations and military matters. You could create hierarchies of allies with different levels of privilege and obligation, managing diverse peoples through differentiated relationships rather than imposing uniform control. These insights weren't theoretical discoveries. They were practical responses to specific situations, but they became patterns, templates that Romans would apply repeatedly as their power expanded beyond Latium into the wider Mediterranean world. Internally, meanwhile, Rome was dealing with the plebeian discontent that had been simmering since the battle's aftermath. The victory at Lake Regillus had temporarily united patricians and plebeians against external threats, but with those threats eliminated, class tensions resurfaced with increasing intensity. The fundamental issue was straightforward. Plebeians felt excluded from real political power despite their contributions to Rome's defense. Yes, they could vote in assemblies. Yes, they could serve in the army. But the magistracies were monopolized by patricians. The Senate was dominated by patricians. The economic advantages that came with political power, favorable legislation, access to public contracts, preferential legal treatment, all flowed primarily to patricians. Plebeian soldiers who had fought at Lake Regillus came home to find themselves in debt, their farms struggling, their families economically vulnerable. Meanwhile, patrician families who had also contributed soldiers to the battle returned to wealth and comfort, their economic position secured by land ownership and political connections that plebeians couldn't access. This wasn't sustainable. Asking citizens to fight for Rome while ignoring their legitimate grievances about political and economic exclusion created resentment that would eventually explode. Some patricians recognized this and pushed for reforms. Others resisted, clinging to traditional privileges, arguing that any concession to plebeian demands would undermine social order. The tensions would ultimately lead to the first succession of the plebs in 494 BC, just 2 years after Lake Regillus, when plebeians would literally leave Rome and set up their own rival community on a nearby hill, forcing the patricians to negotiate and creating the tribune system that would fundamentally reshape Roman politics. But that's getting ahead of the story. In the immediate years after Lake Regillus, these tensions were building but hadn't yet reached crisis point. The Republic was managing barely to maintain internal cohesion while projecting external strength. The cult of Castor and Pollux, meanwhile, continued to grow and develop. The completion of the temple gave the cult a permanent home and institutional structure. Priests were appointed. Rituals were formalized. An annual festival was established. The cult became part of Rome's official religious calendar. Its ceremonies integrated into the regular cycle of public worship. The festival, celebrated on the anniversary of the Battle of Lake Regillus, became one of Rome's major public events. It included a cavalry parade, hundreds of Roman horsemen riding through the city, displaying their horsemanship, honoring Castor and Pollux as divine patrons of cavalry. It included sacrifices at the temple, public feasting, theatrical performances, games and competitions. This festival served multiple purposes. Obviously, it honored the gods who had supposedly saved Rome, but it also reinforced civic identity, gave Romans a shared celebration that brought the community together. It maintained memory of Lake Regillus across generations, ensuring that the story didn't fade, and it provided a venue for public display of Roman military strength, The cavalry parade was both religious ceremony and military demonstration. The story of Lake Regillus itself evolved in the retelling, not in fundamental ways. The core narrative remained consistent, but in details and emphasis. Different versions circulated, each emphasizing different aspects depending on who was telling the story and why. Veterans emphasized the desperate nature of the battle, how close Rome had come to defeat, how the appearance of Castor and Pollux had been genuinely miraculous, rather than just fortunate timing. This version served to maximize the gods' contribution, to emphasize that Rome owed its survival to divine favor rather than just human courage. Patrician historians emphasized the leadership of the consuls and the discipline of the legions, treating the divine intervention as important but secondary to Roman military virtue. This version served to celebrate Roman achievements while acknowledging divine help, maintaining a balance between human agency and divine favor. Plebeian orators emphasized that common soldiers had done most of the fighting, that plebeian citizens had bled and died for the Republic, that divine favor had extended to all Romans regardless of class. This version served to argue for political reform, using the battle as evidence that plebeians deserved equal participation in governance. All these versions were true in some sense, emphasized different aspects of the same event, shaped the story to serve different purposes. This is how historical memory works, not as simple record of what happened, but as ongoing interpretation and reinterpretation, each generation finding new meaning in old stories. The Battle of Lake Regillus also influenced Roman military thinking. The importance of maintaining formation under pressure, demonstrated so dramatically when the Roman left flank held despite being nearly overwhelmed, became a central principle of Roman tactics. Roman military training emphasized discipline and mutual support, creating legions that could maintain cohesion even in desperate circumstances. The cavalry aspect, the appearance of divine horsemen and their devastating impact, encouraged Rome to develop better cavalry forces. Rome had traditionally been infantry-focused, like most Italian cities, but Lake Regillus suggested that cavalry, properly deployed, could be decisive. Roman military planners began paying more attention to cavalry recruitment and training, developing the mounted forces that would eventually become an important part of Roman armies. The victory also influenced Roman strategic thinking about alliances and regional politics. The Latin League had been dangerous precisely because it was a coalition of multiple cities with combined resources. This taught Rome to be cautious about allowing potential enemies to form coalitions, to prefer bilateral relationships where Rome negotiated with individual cities rather than facing organized alliances. This approach, preventing potential enemies from uniting, maintaining relationships with individual powers rather than coalitions, using divide-and-rule tactics, would become characteristic of Roman diplomacy. It wasn't always pretty or noble, but it was effective, allowing Rome to manage much larger territories than would have been possible through direct military control alone. In the decades following Lake Regillus, Rome consolidated its position in Latium and began looking beyond. The Volci and Oequi, mountain peoples who raided Roman and Latin territory, became targets of Roman military campaigns. These wars were smaller than the conflict with the Latin League, but important for establishing Roman control over wider regions. Rome also began developing relationships with more distant Italian peoples, the Sabines, the Etruscans, various smaller tribal groups. These relationships were complex and often hostile, but they represented Rome's expanding sphere of interest, its growing ambition to be more than just the dominant city in Latium. The story of Castor and Pollux at Lake Regillus became a reference point in these diplomatic and military activities. Roman ambassadors telling foreign powers about divine intervention at Lake Regillus were implicitly threatening. Our gods intervene in battles. Can yours? Roman generals preparing for campaigns would sacrifice at the temple of Castor and Pollux, publicly seeking the divine favor that had saved Rome before. This wasn't cynical manipulation, though it was certainly strategic. Romans genuinely believed in their gods and genuinely thought they had special relationships with certain divine powers. But they also recognized that belief in divine favor was itself a kind of power. That reputation for divine protection could intimidate enemies and inspire allies. By the time a generation had passed since Lake Regillus, by the time children born after the battle were old enough to fight in Rome's legions, the story had become foundational to Roman identity. Every Roman child knew about Castor and Pollux appearing on white horses, knew about the miraculous victory, knew that Rome was specially favored by the gods. This belief shaped behavior. Romans fought with confidence born from believing the gods were on their side. They negotiated with authority that came from divine endorsement. They built their republic with the certainty that they were creating something blessed and protected by divine powers. Whether the gods had actually intervened at Lake Regillus became in some ways less important than the fact that Romans believed they had. Belief shaped reality, created confidence and cohesion, and commitment that made the Republic stronger regardless of whether the original divine intervention had been real or imagined. The Temple of Castor and Pollux stood in the Forum as permanent reminder of this belief, as architectural embodiment of Rome's relationship with divine powers, as monument to victory and divine favor and republican survival. Future Romans would walk past it daily, would be reminded of the day their city had been saved by gods, would draw strength and confidence from knowing they were part of something divinely protected. Lake Regillus had been a battle, a specific military engagement on a specific day in 496 BC, but it had become something more, a foundation story, a mythic moment, a shared memory that defined Roman identity and shaped Roman behavior for generations afterward. The Republic had survived its greatest test, had proven itself viable, had earned divine favor through virtue and courage and willingness to sacrifice. That was the message of Lake Regillus, the meaning Romans drew from victory and divine intervention, and temple construction and annual festivals. Whether it was true didn't matter as much as the fact that Romans believed it, acted on that belief, created a republic that lived up to the legend of divine favor and special destiny. Centuries after the Battle of Lake Regillus, long after every person who fought there had died, long after the immediate political circumstances that produced the battle had faded into historical curiosity, Romans still told the story. They told it to children as a bedtime tale about gods who saved their city. They told it to soldiers as inspiration before battle. They told it in the Senate when debating whether the Republic remained worthy of divine favor. They told it constantly, compulsively, because it said something fundamental about who Romans believed themselves to be. The story evolved in the telling, naturally. Details shifted, emphases changed, new elements were added to address contemporary concerns, but the core remained constant. Rome had faced an existential threat, had been on the verge of defeat, and the gods Castor and Pollux had personally intervened to save the Republic. Divine favor had been demonstrated, proven, made undeniable. By the time of the late Republic, the era of Caesar and Cicero and Pompey, several centuries after Lake Regillus, the story had become so embedded in Roman consciousness that you couldn't question it without questioning Roman identity itself. Skeptics who suggested that maybe the divine intervention hadn't actually happened, maybe the victory could be explained through natural causes, were treated not just as wrong but as almost blasphemous, as challenging something sacred about what it meant to be Roman. This isn't unusual in history. Every culture has foundation stories, narratives that define collective identity, events that can't be questioned without destabilizing the community's understanding of itself. For Americans, it's stories like Washington crossing the Delaware, or Lincoln preserving the Union. For Romans, it was stories like Romulus founding the city, and Castor and Pollux saving the Republic at Lake Regillus. The historical accuracy of these stories matters less than their cultural function. They provide shared reference points, create common identity, transmit values across generations. Whether Castor and Pollux actually appeared at Lake Regillus is a question historians can debate, but that Romans believed they did, and shaped their society based on that belief, is indisputable historical fact. The Temple of Castor and Pollux remained one of Rome's most important buildings for the entire life of the Republic, and well into the Empire. It was rebuilt several times as it aged or was damaged, each reconstruction maintaining, and often enhancing its grandeur. The version that eventually stood in the Forum, 3 massive columns that you can still see ruins of today, was rebuilt by the Emperor Tiberius in the early 1st century AD, 500 years after the original temple's dedication. 500 years. Think about that temporal distance. The Battle of Lake Regillus was as ancient to Romans living in the Empire as the American Revolution is to us today. Yet the story remained vital, the temple remained important, the cult of Castor and Pollux remained active. That's remarkable cultural continuity, remarkable persistence of memory across centuries of change. The story served different purposes in different eras. In the early Republic, immediately after Lake Regillus, it was primarily about divine validation of the Republican experiment, about proving that the revolution against the Tarquins had been divinely sanctioned. Romans needed to believe that overthrowing their king had been right, that the gods approved, that the Republic was legitimate. The appearance of Castor and Pollux provided that validation. As the Republic matured and expanded, the story became more about Rome's special relationship with divine powers, about why Rome succeeded where other cities failed. Roman armies conquered Italy, then the Mediterranean, eventually controlling an empire spanning from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. How did a single city accomplish this? The answer for many Romans was divine favor. The gods protected Rome, intervened when necessary, ensured Roman success. Lake Regillus was proof, the foundational evidence that this divine relationship was real. During the late Republic, when internal conflicts threatened to tear Rome apart, when civil wars erupted between competing generals and political factions, the story took on yet another meaning. Reformers on all sides invoked Lake Regillus to argue that their cause had divine favor, that the gods who had saved the Republic in 4096 BC would surely support those fighting to preserve or restore republican virtue. Both Caesar and his opponents claimed to be the true heirs of divine favor. Both cited Lake Regillus as evidence that the gods intervened in Roman affairs. This flexibility, this ability to reinterpret the story to serve different purposes, was part of its strength. Unlike rigid dogma that couldn't adapt to new circumstances, the Lake Regillus story could be deployed for various ends, while maintaining its core message: the gods cared about Rome, intervened in critical moments, favored the Republic and those who defended it. The question that's always haunted this story, that haunted ancient skeptics and haunts modern historians, is whether the divine intervention actually happened. Did Castor and Pollux actually manifest physically on the battlefield? Or is this a legend created afterward to explain a fortunate victory? The honest answer is that we can't know with certainty. We weren't there. We don't have video footage or independent verification. All we have are Roman sources, written generations after the event, clearly presenting a version of history that served Roman interests and beliefs. But here's the thing, the question might be less important than it seems. Whether or not the gods actually appeared, something happened at Lake Regillus that shifted the battle's momentum at a crucial moment. Whether that something was divine intervention, exceptional human warriors whose identities were lost or obscured, a lucky break, enemy mistakes, Roman discipline prevailing, or some combination of these factors, the effect was the same. Rome won a battle it appeared to be losing. The Republic survived, and Romans interpreted this survival as divine intervention. They built temples, established cults, told stories, shaped their entire religious and political culture around the belief that gods had saved their city. That belief, regardless of its factual basis, had real consequences. It created confidence, cohesion, commitment to the Republic. It made Romans believe they were special, chosen, protected by divine powers. That belief drove behavior. Romans fought with confidence born from divine favor. They built institutions they believed were blessed. They expanded their power, believing the gods supported their mission. Whether the gods actually did support them is a theological question beyond historical analysis. But that Romans believed in divine support and acted accordingly is simply historical fact. Modern readers might find this frustrating. We want definitive answers about what really happened. Did the gods appear or didn't they? But ancient people weren't as concerned with that kind of factual precision. They experienced the world differently, saw divine action in events we might explain naturally, interpreted reality through religious frameworks that made divine intervention not just possible but expected. When ancient Romans said Castor and Pollux appeared at Lake Regillus, they weren't making a claim that could be verified or falsified through historical method. They were expressing a religious truth, a belief about their relationship with divine powers, an interpretation of events that made sense within their worldview. We can respect that without necessarily accepting it. We can acknowledge that for Romans the divine intervention at Lake Regillus was real and meaningful, while also maintaining appropriate historical skepticism about supernatural claims. Both positions can coexist, the ancient believer's certainty and the modern skeptic's doubt, because they're answering different questions, operating in different frameworks. What we can say definitively is that the Battle of Lake Regillus was a turning point for the Roman Republic. It eliminated the Tarquin threat that had hung over Rome since the Revolution. It established Roman dominance in Latium through military victory and subsequent diplomacy. It created a foundation story about divine favor that would shape Roman identity for centuries. And it proved that the Republic could survive serious military challenges, that free citizens defending their freedom were effective warriors. These outcomes didn't require divine intervention to be significant. Even if we explain the victory entirely through natural causes, Roman discipline, Latin mistakes, fortunate timing, whatever, the consequences remain profound. Rome emerged from Lake Regillus as a regional power, confident and legitimate, ready to begin the expansion that would eventually create an empire. The soldiers who fought at Lake Regillus couldn't have predicted any of this. They were just trying to survive the immediate crisis, to defend their city against enemies who wanted to destroy the Republic. They didn't know they were participating in a foundational moment of Western history, fighting a battle that would be remembered and retold for thousands of years. Most of them were ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen temporarily serving as soldiers, citizens doing their duty, men who wanted nothing more than to go home to their families after the fighting ended. Some never made it home. 3,000 Roman dead meant 3,000 families grieving, 3,000 lives cut short, 3,000 stories that ended at Lake Regillus. We don't know most of their names. Ancient history rarely preserved common soldiers' identities. They died anonymously, were cremated in mass pyres, were remembered collectively rather than individually. But their service, their sacrifice, their willingness to fight for the Republic, that collective contribution was what made Roman victory possible. The consuls got credit in the histories, Castor and Pollux got credit in the legends, but the actual fighting was done by thousands of individual soldiers whose names have been lost, whose contributions went unrecognized except in the abstract collective sense of the Roman army fought bravely. That's often how history works. We remember leaders and gods and dramatic moments, but we forget the ordinary people whose collective efforts actually made everything happen. The temple of Castor and Pollux stood as a monument to divine intervention, but there was no comparable monument to the 3,000 dead Romans whose sacrifice was equally essential to victory. Well, except in a larger sense. The Republic itself was the monument. Every year the Republic survived and prospered, every generation that lived in freedom rather than under monarchy, every Roman who participated in self-governance, all of that was memorial to those who died at Lake Regillus defending the Republican experiment. As centuries passed and Rome transformed from city-state to empire, the significance of Lake Regillus shifted but never disappeared. Imperial Romans living under emperors who had restored something very much like monarchy still told stories about the battle where gods fought to preserve republican freedom. There's a certain irony in that, an empire celebrating republican virtue, subjects of emperors honoring divine intervention against monarchy, but maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the Lake Regillus story remained meaningful, precisely because it represented something Romans had lost, a memory of when they had governed themselves, when freedom had been worth fighting for, when ordinary citizens had defended their republic against those who wanted to impose kingship. The story became nostalgic, bittersweet, a reminder of what Rome had been before the civil wars and dictatorships and eventual empire transformed republican government into something very different. Imperial Romans telling the Lake Regillus story to their children weren't just recounting history, they were preserving memory of a time when Rome had been different, when divine favor had protected republican freedom rather than imperial power. The ruins of the Temple of Castor and Pollux still stand in Rome's Forum today. More than 2,000 years after the battle it commemorated, 3 columns remain, towering above the Forum's other ruins, visible landmarks in the archaeological park that preserves ancient Rome's civic center. Tourists photograph these columns constantly, rarely knowing their full history, rarely understanding that they're looking at a monument to alleged divine intervention, to a battle that saved the Roman Republic, to beliefs and stories that shaped Western civilization. The columns are just picturesque ruins, beautiful old stones, part of the visual spectacle that is ancient Rome. But for ancient Romans, those columns, or rather the temple they supported, represented something profound. They were proof physical manifestation of divine favor, architectural testimony to the reality of gods who intervened in human affairs, who cared about Rome, who fought to preserve the Republic. Whether you believe that divine intervention actually occurred, or whether you think it was later legend created to explain natural events, the temple and its story tell us something important about how Romans understood themselves and their place in the world. They believed they were special, chosen, protected by gods. They built institutions based on that belief. They created a republic they thought was divinely sanctioned. They fought to defend it when threatened because they believed the gods would support them. And whether because of divine favor or despite it, whether because of supernatural intervention or just human courage and determination and luck, Rome survived. The Republic endured. Freedom was preserved. The Tarquins never returned. And Lake Regillus became legend, story, memory that lasted longer than the people who experienced it, longer than the buildings built to commemorate it, longer than the Republic it saved. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you might think about those long-ago Roman soldiers, standing in formation near a lake 20 miles from Rome, facing enemies who outnumbered them, fighting for a republic that was just 12 years old, defending an experiment in self-governance that most people expected to fail. They were scared, certainly, but they held their ground. They fought when the fighting started, and when 2 mysterious horsemen appeared on white horses, whether gods or men or something else entirely, they took heart, they pressed forward, they won. That courage, That commitment to defending freedom even when the outcome seemed uncertain. That willingness to stand and fight for something they believed in. That's what Lake Regillus was really about. The divine intervention story is dramatic and memorable, but the human story underneath it, ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they valued their freedom, that's the heart of why Romans told and retold this story for centuries. The republic they fought for eventually fell, transformed into empire, was conquered by barbarians, faded into history, but the stories survived, the memory persisted, and the idea that free people defending their freedom are capable of extraordinary things, that idea, tested and proven at Lake Regillus, remains relevant even now, 25 centuries later. Sleep well, knowing that courage matters, that freedom is worth defending, that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when circumstances demand it. The soldiers at Lake Regillus teach us that much, regardless of whether gods fought alongside them, and that's the end of our story, for tonight at least. The Battle of Lake Regillus is over. The Tarquins are finished, the Republic has survived, new challenges await Rome, but that's a story for another time. Rest now, and dream of white horses and divine twins, of courage and freedom, of battles won and republics saved.